Hey everybody, this is Thomas of Cinema to the Letter. Here at the top, just want to say that in this pretty long episode, when we do get to Godzilla X Kong: The New Empire, just keep in mind there will be spoilers. After all, this is a very new movie, still in theaters as of this recording. So if you haven't seen it yet and you have any interest and don't want to be spoiled on Godzilla X Kong, this is your blanket right at the top spoiler warning for this particular episode. But on with the show. Hello and welcome to Cinema to the Letter. This episode's that new film known as Godzilla X Kong: The New Empire. On Cinema to the Letter, we break down the very nature of cinema, letter by letter. For each episode of a film season topic, we cover 6 films that fit a C for classic, I for an indie, N for new, E for egregious, M for masterpiece, and A for atypical. Because who doesn't love an acronym, am I right? I am Thomas, and a podcast recording is in session.
God. Oh, hello. I'm Bryan, and I am glad that you and I, Thomas, finally get representation in movies. You know, finally podcasters can feel represented in cinema.
You know, we talked about this sort of history of cinematic podcasters becoming thicker.
Yes.
Post your Ghostbusters Afterlife. Real groundbreaking thing of a character name podcast. 'Cause that's a good
true.
movie.
Don't worry, I know you haven't seen the new Ghostbusters. He's in there. Our boy podcast is back.
And I guess Ghostbusters The Frozen Empire, which I've heard some people say this. You could switch those titles for this and Ghostbusters, and they mean the same thing, right?
Yes, and also because both movies feature a creature, monster, whatever thing that is like ice-based, like frost-based. You know, they're trying to freeze everything.
Right. Well, hold on, Bryan. This movie's pretty new, so we might not want to go into extreme detail. Because yes, on this episode of Cinema to the Letter, in our Godzilla season, we are doing our N for new, and for the first time in our history, we mean brand spanking new. We are recording this a mere 48 hours after we've seen it in theaters in the Dolby Cinema together, Bryan. Usually we say this for the Patreon, patreon.com/cinema2letter for very new movies. You know, we decided to, with our kind of shuffling of the schedule from our previous episode -1, probably would have been our end for new in most circumstances. So we decided, you know what? Let's go super new. The New Empire. How do you feel about this going into it, doing a movie that's this brand new as a full episode of the main feed?
I mean, I'm excited, and, I think with -1 and with this movie we're talking about, it's very interesting to get literal opposite sides of the coin for Godzilla, like just completely opposite films. But also, there's a bit of a bit of trepidation, especially because, this is also our kind of platform to talk about this new Monsterverse, because it's kind of, I kept thinking about this as I've been thinking about this movie, and it's weird how they've weirdly enough molded a somewhat successful franchise out of like these monsters and this kind of, using the Toho monsters, using King Kong and stuff like that. And it's a really fascinating kind of franchise that is currently going in Hollywood right now.
We'll talk about the Monsterverse for sure, but I think before we get to the movie itself, this particular season obviously is about Godzilla, King of the Monsters. But this is a two-hander, Bryan. One of those hands, in this case, has a glove that's mechanic. At a certain point, the royalty, King Kong himself, who's a creature that is much like Godzilla, made originally for the screen, not based on any other material, though in that case from Marion C. Cooper. And this is a monster that's been around since 1933 and has had various different film adaptations. He was in some of the Toho movies, in the original King Kong versus Godzilla, which that's what about 50 years of time will do. You get bumped to second build. But I just think, he's a fascinating one, especially much more of an American creation than
Right.
Godzilla obviously was. How do you feel about King Kong? Because you've watched a few things recently, particularly the original film for the first time.
Yeah, I mean, because I mainly grew up watching the Peter Jackson movie a lot for some reason.
Right.
I remember, and especially I think part of it was because that movie's so big, right? Like the most expensive movie ever made at the time, and of course it was Jackson coming off of Lord of the Rings and Return of the King, like sweeping the Oscars and everything.
Getting to finally do something he tried to do in 1996.
That's true.
Trivia.
Right.
There's a little documentary I would recommend to anybody of the original attempt at this production of Peter Jackson right after Heavenly Creatures.
Right. Yes. But I'd never seen the original, actually. And I watched it a few weeks ago. We did our March Madness based on movie monsters, which was a whole lot of fun.
Kong and Godzilla have appearances. They have a couple matches in there.
Yep. But watching, that original movie, and especially watching the Peter Jackson one afterwards, I was also I was taken aback by how much Peter Jackson really adapted that 30s version. Like, I think I said this to you, where he basically just takes the movie and goes like, just kind of stretches it out like a piece of silly putty or whatever, and just really expands it from being like, I mean, the original is like 100 minutes to if you watch the extended version of the Peter Jackson, it's like what, 3.5 hours, something like
320.
that. Yeah,
I watched it as well recently.
Right. But I mean, watching that original one, it's like, I love all of the sort of practical effects in terms of like the stop motion for the monsters and King Kong himself and stuff like that. Obviously, like an incredibly important movie for, many, many, many reasons. But yeah, I had mainly grown up with the Peter Jackson one. Yeah, I was fascinated to revisit that one. But what about you? What is kind of your history with Kong?
The first time I ever saw anything King Kong related was the climax of the 1976 film. I remember this very distinctly being in my father's old wood panel, sort of like side room.
Nice.
I have a lot of memories of that, watching television, the Star Wars movies I originally watched in that particular setting, shit like that. And I remember just being very bummed out, especially considering you didn't see the 76 film.
No, I still have not, because you have told me it's bad.
I rewatched that. I rewatched a lot of Kong stuff in prep for this. But yeah, the thing is, that movie is 70s in terms of it's also very gory. Like, when Kong gets shot, it's like gallons of fake blood kind of thing. And the big thing about the, in the original film, it's the Empire State Building, iconically. Yep. Also in the Peter Jackson one, in the 76 film, it's the Twin Towers.
Which is interesting.
Kong jumps from tower to tower at one point. It's
cool.
Interesting. Like, the thing I like, yes, is anything to do with the actual Kong suit and the models. But yeah, it's still just odd. And then he falls, and then he's like right down in that lobby area of the old Twin Towers back in the 70s. So it's an interesting kind of historical landmark, even though there's also terrible sets in that fucking movie. God. But anyway. So that was my first exposure. And then for a while, Kong was just sort of more of like a cultural osmosis thing, like specific imagery from the original, particularly, of course, the iconic Simpsons Treehouse of Horror episode 3, the King Homer parody.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Which is extremely funny. Yeah, women and semen don't mix. But so I was aware of Kong more in that way. And then I watched the original probably in high school. And then I also watched the Peter Jackson one in theaters. And yeah, I remember really liking it when I was younger, and then kind of growing distant from it. Rewatched it recently, the extended cut. I do agree with you, like, it stretches things out in an interesting way, but they're on that fucking boat for a while.
Look, man. Yeah, it's a very weird thing for me to watch that movie again, because I watched it a lot as a kid, or I thought I did, but I don't remember anything from, like, when they get to Skull Island, really.
Yeah.
That kind of section for me kind of, like, was gone. But, like, yeah, they are on that boat for a very long time, which I personally don't mind the length necessarily. I quite love...
I don't mind it after they get off the boat, truly. Like, once they're on the island and encountering creatures and stuff. It's so fun in, like, the usual Peter Jackson ways. I like the extended cut and nothing else for just that one sequence he adds during the New York bit where there's, like, truck full of cops. And they're like, all right, we're going to get after Kong, we're going to defeat him, we're going to destroy him. And then Kong just smashes into them and destroys them immediately.
Yeah. Yeah.
Great bit. Love
I
that
mean,
there.
yeah, and my kind of issues with this, with the Peter Jackson version of it, are I'm still a bit iffy on Jack Black as the main character. I love Jack Black in general. I'm
What are you talking about? He's
yes,
great doing all the eyebrow stuff.
it's a lot. I don't think it works all the way necessarily. But just an interesting kind of like that entire cast is a very like 2005 cast, right? With getting Naomi Watts, Adrian Brody is in there. Like it's a very 2005 cast in a lot of ways, and
Especially if you're not making a movie that'll play it like TIFF and then never play again like Naomi Watts.
right. Oh, yeah, Naomi Watts is incredible in the
Yes.
Peter Jackson movie, though. She's really, really great, and I think like yeah, someone needs to get her in a good movie, please, God.
That's probably why I want David Lynch to keep making things.
Oh my gosh, please.
Naomi's got to at least have one more good movie in her.
Yeah, I think I've told you this before, but just I love the story that Naomi Watts has told of David Lynch after she did King Kong, and David Lynch just goes like, anyone who sits in the hand of Kong will be a star for life, and it's just
True.
great to imagine David Lynch saying that.
Because of course, do you know who it is in the 70s version?
Jessica Lange.
In her film debut.
Right, yeah.
And her last movie for like 4 years until, I think, right before Tootsie, which won her an Oscar.
Oh,
which is an interesting career.
yeah. That's crazy.
To Jeff Bridges, who's the male lead of that, and their Carl Denham is, of course, Charles Grodin, the best part of that film.
That's, yeah. I mean,
There's
it sounds great, and then you've told me this movie is very bad, and I'm kind of interested
watch it
to
for
watch it.
Grodin at some point. I think Grodin's performance is worth watching it at least one time, because he plays like an oil tycoon. He's not a film director, and there's a point where he has binoculars and he's on the island, and he sees bubble and crude, like oil, and he's just like got binoculars and his teeth are gnashing like this, and yeah, there it is. He does a lot of that. It's a very teeth gnashy performance in the best way.
Yeah. Okay. I gotta watch it at some point.
Watch that instead of King Kong Lives, which I also watched, I should mention. Do you know what this is at all?
I've heard of it, but go on, please. Tell us.
10 years after the 70s King Kong, Dino De Laurentiis, who produced that film, made a lot of money off that film, finally was like, let's do a King Kong sequel where Kong definitively dies at the end of the 76 movie. Like I mentioned, gore falls. It turns out Kong is alive, and it's because they're able to transplant a heart into him. But now, they need a blood transfusion. And so they find a Lady Kong on Skull Island.
Of course. Right.
Who comes over, and then they have the blood transfusion, but then they're like connected. And they're very intimate with each other. And the suits are terrible, first off. If you look them up, they are significantly worse. Right.
Okay, I'm looking at one here where like you can clearly see like the human eyes in the eye like socket. Yeah, this looks bad. It's like 20 years on from like 2001, and yet it looks worse than the apes in 2001.
Especially considering the original has, I think I said, the suit's very impressive, a lot of expressive kind of like mouth movements. And he is played by Rick Baker in the suit.
Right.
Which was something he didn't want to do. But they could, like the stunt person, like bailed at the last second, so he had to just start shooting. But King Kong Lives, terrible. But easily the worst Kong thing I saw. Even worse than like Son of Kong, the sequel that came out 9 months after the 33 film. And is 70 minutes long. And it's just Carl Denham like, oh, I have a bunch of people trying to sue me. I need to get some money. Son of Kong? And they find a Son of Kong 30 minutes into like the 70-minute movie. And not that much. Shocker, there's not a lot of stop motion in this movie that took 9 months to make.
Right. Yeah. Gosh. I mean, and this is the kind of interesting thing about like Kong, I guess now. Rewatching the Peter Jackson movie, it does feel in a lot of ways like a definitive version of like that story, especially with how faithful it is to the original and stuff like that. But it takes a lot of the original stuff and really just like puts it on the biggest budget possible especially the visual effects of it all, I think are so impressive still to this day with Andy Serkis playing Kong, and
Yes.
it's really, really incredible CGI. And it does feel like King Kong is one of these things where like they haven't tried to make another one since this, up until like Skull Island, which is a very different movie and obviously like is not doing what the Peter Jackson one did.
Like the big thing about Kong, we should mention, we've been saying it, there are 3 different versions of the exact same story. There are like 3 of the 10 movies that have featured Kong prominently,
Right.
and that were like theatrically released. And I think it's just a testament to the fact that like that original movie is like so inherently iconic, but at the same time, I think it exposes the trouble that like there's not a lot you can do with Kong.
Yeah.
Really, like Kong's a great character and can be expressive. I like some of his other appearances, like say in the second Toho movie that he was in, King Kong Escapes, which is an incredibly fun film from 1967, in which Kong has to face off against Gorosaurus, who was previously in Destroy All Monsters, and also Mecha Kong, a big robot Kong. And
Very
it's
cool.
partially based on a Rankin Bass produced show, the guys who did like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and shit, a cartoon from like '66. And it's very cartoony, it's very goofy, but it is Ishiro Honda, of course, director of many of those. And it's a very fun thing. The evil villain is like almost like a wizard, and he's called Doctor Who. This is very early in the BBC Doctor Who existing at this point. Fun movie though, very silly.
Yeah, you're right. There's not a lot you can do with him necessarily. Even like the Peter Jackson movie, like that movie's really stretched out, but a lot of it is just Peter Jackson doing like fun Peter Jackson stuff where he's like killing off the crew in really like gory and like horrific ways and stuff like that. He's doing like the spider pit sequence and kind of rebuilding that. It is a lot more stuff that is just like the island stuff that is less to do with Kong, as he's kind of like off with Naomi Watts. He has a dinosaur fight, which looks great, I think.
A lot of weight to that CG, which is something I think we'll talk about with our main feature.
Yes.
For sure. But something I also want to mention about Kong, which we haven't really addressed yet, but it's just a thing inherent to like the various different versions of him. Kong, like I said, is American made, for better and worse. With particularly sort of the Skull Island population is always an interesting thing, especially in the original 30s movie, in honestly the King Kong versus Godzilla from the 60s. There's an indigenous population thing they kind of have been dealing with to varying degrees of well executed.
Yes, it's always something that is like kind of concerning, but I think it's the thing about the Peter Jackson one, which it is not a good representation of like indigenous populations or anything
of like
that.
human beings as at all.
But I mean, what I kind of like about it is, one, I can't believe a studio let him do it like that in that way, and two, and I know you don't like this kind of sequence, but it's the part where he really goes like full like. The step printing is going wild. It's just looking insane. It looks like a Lord of the Rings like sequence, and it's insane looking. But it is also, a bit offensive, Peter. But it's such an insane decision, I think.
Well, I mean, but even in the original movie, it's pretty like awful. It's got one of the cast members, Noble Johnson, who's a guy famous for playing sort of various different ethnicities around that time. Yeah, it just feels like it's definitely so far behind the times, but Kong is an incredibly fascinating character when you let him have weight. Like that original movie does with Willis O'Brien's amazing stop motion, or I would say the Rick Baker suit in the 70s movie, or even Andy Serkis, like you mentioned. His trial run for the Planet of the Apes movies is that King Kong. And I think that like obviously the CGI is such a stepping stone to those Apes movies, which I think, for my money, are like some of the best CGI in any modern movie, or like the new Planet of the Apes movies. Like they're so insanely good looking, I think, and like look real. Like it feels kind of like dumb and cheap to say, but like they look just straight up like real apes in those movies. And we should acknowledge another thing very important to our discussion today. We're releasing this May 7th. We're mere days away from Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes coming out.
So excited. Yes.
Which we'll definitely cover on the Patreon, and we've already would have recently covered all the Planet of the Apes films in April.
Yep.
But anyway, that's enough about that. Let's kind of get out of just talking about Kong. We're going to transition into our feature presentation, Godzilla X Kong, The New Empire.
For centuries, there was harmony.
What is that?
Kong can't stop this on his own.
He won't be alone.
So, Godzilla X Kong, The New Empire, came out so long ago, Brian. March 29th, 2024. We were mere babes then.
We were different people back then.
Before we saw the latest Godzilla and King Kong feature, Godzilla X Kong, The New Empire. I know we're not supposed to say the X, but...
Are we not? Is that a...
I think, yeah, because I've heard a lot of people just say Godzilla Kong. Like, you're not supposed to pronounce the X, but I think my first compliment to this movie, if you're going to make a sequel to Godzilla vs. Kong, that's a cooler way to go, where it's like, nah, they're buds. There's an X here. Yeah. This is it's, we're continuing math. We did subtraction. We're doing multiplication now.
Yep.
Godzilla X Kong equals The New Empire. But yeah, so brand new movie from Adam Wingard, who let's talk about a bit, because some of the prep I know you've been doing for this is you've been watching a couple Adam Wingard films.
Yeah, I mean, because I like you, I'm sure, I remember when Adam Wingard was coming up as like the small indie horror director, and I remember when You're Next came out, it was like kind of a big deal. I think it was like a really big kind of moment for especially indie horror, and
Sir, I was around for the first VHS.
Oh sure, right. I've never seen any of those, but
and the ABCs of Death, his anthology works, VHS 2 in particular. His segment's very good in that as well. But that one also has the Gareth Evans one, which rules.
Oh, okay.
But anyway, so Adam Wingard, who has, like you mentioned, an interesting career with stuff like his very indie horror stuff. I don't know if you've seen any of that, like A Horrible Way to Die.
Oh, sure, yeah. I'm aware of it, but I haven't seen it.
The mumblecoreiest
yes.
of the Adam Wingard films. But yeah, he made a lot of those indie horrors and horror movies, and he did the anthologies. But You're Next, I remember, came out at Fantastic Fest originally in 2011, and that's when I heard about it at first. I'm like, oh, this sounds really cool. Everyone's saying it's great. It took 2 years to come out until I went with some friends in college, and it ruled in the theater. It was fun, and it's like a very small movie. It disappeared off the face of the earth, but it made like I think 3 times its budget.
Yeah.
And it's like 2 weeks in theaters. So it did very well. And then they did The Guest, which we'll put a pin in that. I think someone wants to talk about The Guest a bit later. But then he kind of got swallowed up by Hollywood, because right after that is Blair Witch, right?
Yes.
That's the first big movie.
It is, but even then I think that kind of had a lot of like, because I remember it was billed as The Woods. A
teaser trailer was released initially a couple weeks before. And then, as they were going to, I believe it was San Diego Comic-Con, had a screening of that movie, The Woods. And as people were watching it, they're like, it's a fucking Blair Witch sequel? And it was. Right. And they walked out with the posters, and art had been changed.
Very cool. And that was a great kind of like, obviously borrowing a bit from like the Cloverfield thing. Like, remember the Cloverfield paradox? When we all thought like...
This is pre-Cloverfield paradox.
Yes, right.
Though. This is the trial run, I would argue.
Well, I believe it's I think it's the same year as 10 Cloverfield Lane, which kind of got like a bit of a surprise, like, not entirely a surprise release like that, but it was kind of like, hey, this is a Cloverfield movie, go see it in like a month or whatever, And of
course, the original film had the trailer premiered in front of which movie, Brian? Do you know?
For 10 Cloverfield Lane?
No, the original Cloverfield.
Oh, the original. I don't know that one. What movie?
Transformers. Yes. Which I remember, I was there opening weekend for Transformers. I was amongst the crowd who saw the fucking Statue of Liberty for the first time. That's my train going up to the screen.
That's actually interesting, because I think the first time I saw either the 10 Cloverfield Lane or the Blair Witch trailer was in front of another Michael Bay movie, the 13 Hours, the Benghazi movie. I think that was like, I
Very
saw
similar
the trailer
films.
for that, and I was like, oh, this is cool. That looks really cool. But I remember, yeah, that being kind of an interesting thing of like, oh, he's making a Blair Witch sequel. It kind of makes sense for him to do it, especially if you've seen like his previous movies. It's not him going up too high in terms of budget. Like, it's still kind of small to mid budget. But we've talked about that movie. I don't think that movie's good. It's interesting, but I don't think it's a very good movie.
Which sets a precedent, I would argue, for a lot of Wingard's Hollywood work afterward.
Well, right, because
goes Blair Witch, then it's Death Note, Netflix, which is worse. Bad movie.
a really bad movie. And a
Having
movie
no experience with like the source material at all. It's
Me
just a
neither.
bad movie. Yeah.
Yeah, and kind of weirdly enough, as like obviously he's successful still, and you know, he will still get to do things. But that really feels like a movie that like will stick with him. Where like I was talking to people like, I'm rewatching The Guest. This is the guy who did like the new Godzilla movie, and then someone was like, he made the Death Note like live action movie. I was like, yeah, it wasn't his finest hour necessarily, but then after that is these two Godzilla movies, and so it's really interesting, I think, from the perspective of like for basically a decade now, he's kind of only been working off of like previous IP essentially, which is a really interesting and a bit kind of sad in my opinion, because I think he's a great director, and I would love to see him kind of maybe cash out of like big blockbuster franchises and kind of do something original, because I think it would be really, really interesting to see what he could do, since he clearly has kind of a lot of clout because these movies have done pretty well.
Yeah. Though interesting fact, I think we can agree on this with the Monsterverse, which is sort of the main crux of what we're talking about here, with the Godzilla X Kong being the fifth one after the 2014 Godzilla, then Kong, Skull Island, Godzilla King of the Monsters, Godzilla vs. Kong, and then now Godzilla X Kong, the new empire. And so this series, I think I agree with you. This is one of the more successful cinematic universes. Mm-hmm. The movies are successful, but also I think they really kind of hurt each director who does them.
Yes. Yeah, actually. I mean,
because you got it's Gareth Edwards for the original Godzilla, who after that does Rogue One. Pause. The creator.
Yeah, has a tough time making Rogue One, and kind of stalled his career for a bit. And then Skull Island is Jordan Vogt-Roberts, who,
I watched his original movie, by the way, when it came out originally. The Kings of Summer, I believe is what it was called. Mm-hmm. I liked that movie. I thought that movie was a solid indie movie. And then Skull Island we'll talk about in a second. But he's still attached to Metal Gear Solid, right?
Oof, that is... Yeah, but that's been like... I think since Skull Island came out, I think he was like, I'm making Metal Gear Solid after this. Like, we're going to do it.
And also those weird charges that came up about him, right? He was also as like...
allegations against him, which... Not great. Maybe why he hasn't made a movie in a while.
Perhaps that's part of it. Then Michael Dougherty, who is like the saddest victim to me. Because love Trick or Treat, love Krampus. He also has had an interesting career as a writer, all the way back to the third Urban Legend movie that is straight to video, which is bad, but also easily the best of those movies. I hate those movies. Very bad wannabe Scream franchise, in so many ways. But he has, also some history with like the X-Men movies, and somebody produced his movie Trick or Treat. I don't know. I couldn't see his name. It was fuzzed out. I didn't want to see him.
I can already guess who it was.
Yeah, I really loved, Trick or Treat and Krampus. I think great modern sort of like horror comedies. You've seen Krampus.
Krampus
you love
fucking
Krampus.
rules. That movie is so much fun.
Yeah.
A modern kind of, especially horror movie Christmas, kind of like Gremlins, obviously. Like,
is that an influence?
Oh, yeah, it's...
I think he's just waiting. I think that's why he has like additional story credits. That's all of his credits since King of the Monsters. It's just like writing story by credits and like additional material credits on these Monsterverse movies.
Right.
My bet is he is waiting around until the moment WB's like, should we do a third Gremlins?
Oh, I bet, yeah. Zaslav is gonna fucking
just immediately just darting. Yes, me, please. I'm a company man. I'll do it, Zaslav. Which I think is the best case scenario if that works out.
I would say,
He
yeah.
has a better track record than not, but I don't know, Zaslav.
Yeah, I should watch Trick or Treat. I actually haven't seen Trick or Treat, but I should catch up
Well,
on that
wait
one.
until around the season.
That's true. That's true.
Perhaps. But anyway, so yeah, he had a rough career. And then Wingard, of course, who has been sitting pretty doing Godzilla vs. Kong, which we talked about kind of like after we watched X Kong. A movie that's very much attached to like the rebirth of theaters in the wake of vaccines coming out in March 2021. And doing pretty well on that. And then also one of the few, I think, successes of the Max, the HBO Max same-day launch.
Yeah, I remember watching it on HBO Max because I wasn't fully vaxxed, and I was like, I don't really care about this movie, so I'll watch it on my TV at home. But interesting that movie kind of, did really well despite, like, pandemic and everything.
And, I want to just say, I rewatched the last 3 Monsterverse movies in prep for this, which I think will segue us into talking about just the Monsterverse overall. As someone who has seen, like, all the Godzilla movies, and also the reason I've seen these movies, I think as I mentioned in our C for Classic episode, I was watching the Showa-era movies in the lead up to King of the Monsters coming out. And then I was watching all the Heisei and Millennium, and I also rewatched, like, a bunch of the other stuff. Every movie, pretty much. Except for the 2 anime movies, which I haven't watched yet. And I'm loving. I can't wait. Based on how good that first one is. But it's a frustrating franchise to me, because I think there's a lot of highs and lows. It's a franchise I think is very, like, all over the place in terms of quality, for me, personally. But I don't think you agree with that. I think you don't like most of these movies, right?
Yeah, that's kind of, because I love the 2014 Godzilla. I think I've praised that movie.
You recommended
before.
it on the previous episode.
I did. Yeah, that movie is incredible. I love it still. I think it has aged really, really well. With Kong Skull Island, I thought it looked interesting when it first came out, and the cast looks great, and it was just a real big bummer for me. I was really not into it. I get that you watched Apocalypse Now and you really want to, like, pay homage to it, but it's not that interesting, despite having, like, an incredible John C. Reilly performance and an incredible, like, John Goodman performance. And you've got, like, John Ortiz is in there, Sam Jackson, like, a huge cast. But I think Shea Wiggum, oh my God, like, yeah. But I just really just didn't vibe with that movie.
I know because I witnessed it. That was one of the first movies we saw together, I believe, theatrically, when that originally came out. I remember because you fucking did not like it.
No.
And I was like, oh, this is pretty fun. Like,
I had fun with... There are elements I like in it. Like, I love John C. Reilly. I like the action for the most part. But, like, I don't know. And I've been dreading... I did not revisit it because I was really dreading revisiting that one. But, yeah, I know you do kind of like Skull Island. I don't know, what are your kind of feelings on it?
I rewatched it earlier today. One of the movies I rewatched. That would, I would say, be my second favorite of the Monsterverse movies. I agree with you that it's pulling from previous material, and there's a problem with the amazing cast, most of which is completely wasted. I think particularly, obviously, Brie Larson and Tom Hiddleston. But, I mean, Riley is my favorite of the human characters in these movies, I think. Just... because I said this on Letterboxd and I completely stand by this, if he was kaiju sized, he would just vibe with Godzilla and Kong. He would just... I want that movie.
Yeah, Godzilla X Kong X John C. Reilly.
Well, especially if he's still alive, because the whole thing is that he's a World War II vet.
Yes.
So he's just in, like, super old age makeup.
That stuff is so... It's very good, and it's really funny. I love him. But, man, yeah, the rest of that movie just doesn't really work for me.
I mean, Sam Jackson never phones it in.
No.
To me.
No,
He's been in very bad movies, but he never phones it in. I think he's fun in that movie. But I do like the characterization of Kong. I think that's a very consistent thing with the Monsterverse. The reason I really like it is the personalities, I think, of the monsters have maintained consistency, and they've kind of evolved in interesting ways. They're the most interesting, complex characters in this franchise. You know, there's the human character element, which is not great, I think, in general with these movies. That's the big problem with a lot of them.
Well, yeah, because the one I rewatched in preparation for this was the Godzilla King of the Monsters 2019,
which I also rewatched. Yes,
that's the movie where I think the human stuff is just dire, It is just really bad. And it's really funny, actually, because you mentioned Michael Dougherty. I think that the monster stuff in that movie, when they're actually like fighting and they're on screen, it's really great. And I'm having
When you
like
can see it.
That's another thing, is like it's a lot of dust and rain and like sand in the air and stuff like that, but like it's doing it's interesting stuff, and I'm having a lot of fun with it for some moments when they're fighting. And like you made this point, I think, when we saw X-Kong a few days ago, but like the music is really great as well, and all the themes for like the individual monsters are great. Yes, great.
Also the cover that it's of the fucking Blue Oyster Cult song over the end credits.
Yes.
Yeah, with this guy from what bands? It's like
System of a Down. Is it System of a Down?
Sergei Tankian?
Yep, the lead vocalist for System of a Down. Hell yeah. That's rad as hell.
There's a lot of, I agree with you, like most of the human stuff is pretty terrible. Millie Bobby Brown and the whole family thing with Vera Farmiga is rough. Especially that's one of those many like weird eco-terrorist movies from around this era where it's just like climate change means we have to kill humanity in order to save the earth kind of plots that was really common in the late 2010s, I would say. And Charles Dance and all, just a lot of fucking like, why are you wasted here?
This is the thing, like, and I feel like the entire cast of King of the Monsters feels very like an algorithmic assortment of people who were like famous for being in other things. Where it's like Charles Dance, he was in Game of Thrones, let's get him as the bad guy. Like Millie Bobby Brown, 11, people love Stranger Things. Like Sally Hawkins, she was in The Shape of Water a couple years ago. Like,
and in the previous Godzilla, where she was also, the way she was looking at Godzilla at the end of the 2014 movie, it's not, I can see why the next project is like Shape of Water, based on that look. Before we get off Sally Hawkins, her death in King of the Monsters is like one of the worst like made sequences I've seen in a major blockbuster. Also, I didn't realize she died until, again, this happened when I saw it theatrically, this happened now, like when they show her fucking like picture in the paper, like, oh wait, she died? That's who died? I didn't even see who that was.
Yeah, and that and Ken Watanabe's death are both kind of like, his death is more like, wait, why? He's like, it's the only way. I'm like, no, it's not. What are you talking about? Like, it's so disrespectful, I think.
And they, especially even just for that character who was pretty fun in the original.
Absolutely.
It's such a miscalculation on so many levels. And then we got Godzilla vs. Kong, which I finished right before we started here. And I'm going to say it. I think that's a fun movie. I prefer it to X-Kong, I would say, having revisited it myself.
I probably do too. I didn't revisit it just because I caught like a little bit of it on cable a few weeks ago, and I was just like, yeah, this movie is really not that good. Because it kind of suffers from the similar thing of like, the humans are just not interesting. And like, I think that kind of, to kind of talk about this generally, I think like, we kind of talked a lot about last week in our -1 episode about how like well handled the human stuff is in that movie, how heartfelt it is, how like incredible it is. And it's like, I don't think the solution obviously isn't like put that type of characterization into this movie, because that's just completely like opposite of what, you know, this movie's going for. It's a lot sillier, it's a lot goofier, it's, you know, all that stuff. But they did a good job, I think, with like really making the cast smaller than like King of the Monsters, which is like too big, too many names, too many like stuff going on. Especially the whole like, we'll get to Brian Tyree Henry's character in X-Kong, but in Versus Kong, I just really, really dislike his character. As a fellow podcaster, I get it.
No, I mean, as a fellow podcaster also, I don't disagree that like the human problem is still very much there in that movie, but I think that's another big important thing versus X-Kong, versus X-Kong. But it at least uses the humans for the biggest purpose that you would need them for a Godzilla movie, which is scale. Mm-hmm. And actually showing it to you, unlike certain other people, like Michael Dougherty. I'm sorry, Michael. Most of those action sequences look terrible, as opposed to
they kind of do a little bit.
You kind of mentioned that like they only really meet 3 times, right, and fight. But I think that's solid for like a versus movie, you know, for this kind of thing. And I think also they pour all of the energy into those fights. I like the first one that's on like the big aircraft carrier. And I think he really gets a full sense of both those personalities, where there's a lot of Godzilla mean-mugging people in a fun way. There's a lot of personality there. Also, King Kong being the most tired ape possible. Just like, fuck. This ain't working. Like, Kong struggles, even though he wins the second bout that they have, like, midway through the movie, which I kind of like. And then by the end of it, the last fight, it's like Godzilla rightfully, I think, kills Kong, basically, and have to, like, fucking light up Vegas or whatever they say in order for him to, like, be defibrillated. But then Kong gets up, and he was just like, oh, Mechagodzilla's bad? Okay, my shoulder's out of place. Let me use a fucking giant-ass skyscraper to put it back into place.
Yeah, that's pretty
That shit's fun. That's the thing. There's a lot more of, like, there's personality, but there is also still a sense of scale. I think the personality remains in X Kong. Not as much the scale, because, like, you know, spoilers as we finally get into, like, the meat of our subject for today, since this is so new. Spoilers, once again. But Godzilla X Kong kind of takes place, you know, a few years after versus Kong, where we're following, you know, our sort of family unit of Rebecca Hall as Dr. Eileen Andrews, you know, our favorite character.
Look, I really love Rebecca Hall. I'm always happy to see her in a movie, but yeah, it is very weird that she's in this, like, franchise as a character who has to just spout a lot of, you know, gobbledygook. A lot of
bad exposition
hogwash.
or funny faces.
Yes.
That's her role in this.
She got a haircut, though, as opposed from versus Kong, so, you know, new hairstyle, it's great.
New do, new look, new you. But yeah, just she's carried back over from Godzilla vs. Kong, along with her adopted daughter, Jai, played by Kaylee Hottle. You know, she's an adolescent now, and she's trying to adjust to school, but she can't really adjust because she doesn't belong. And she's just having these visions of Kong, as well, the three pyramids that she keeps drawing, all this other shit. And then, as it turns out, it's like, oh, there's some event going on in Hollow Earth where we last left Kong, who is introduced in this movie, I think, very well. I like the opening bit of this with Kong, where he's just, like, being followed by a bunch of, like, weird creatures after, like, he wakes up and there's a fucking rock song over it. And then, like, he gets attacked by a bunch of creatures, and then he kills one of them and bathes in their green blood, and then washes himself off and goes about his day.
Yeah, I actually kind of am, like, interested in, like, the setup of this, of, like, you know, because there is, like, Monarch, right? Which, have you seen any of the show, by the way? I'm kind of curious.
I watched the pilot earlier today, but go
Okay.
on for a bit. I'll talk about that in a minute.
Yeah, just the idea of, like, she works for Monarch. They're kind of, like, keeping track of these monsters, finding out where they are, what they're doing, so they don't, like, destroy the world again or whatever. So they don't destroy, like, the top 3 cities in the world or anything like that. And a lot of that stuff, I'm like, okay, this is kind of cool, of, like, how do you track Godzilla? How do you track Kong and keep tabs on him? We have to devote, like, 10 minutes to Godzilla resting in the Coliseum like he's a little cat.
Look, honorary Italian Godzilla. I'm saying I can do it. I say Godzilla is honorary Italian. He's there with Bob Hoskins from the Super Mario Brothers movie and Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
Do you could they get him riding a little Vespa, like Russell Crowe in The Pope's Exorcist? Do you think they can get him a Vespa for the next movie?
Oh God, Vespa! But that's how he rides into Mario Kart.
Yeah, but I like just the setup of it. I do kind of like the setup of Kong, just kind of like dealing with other monsters around and stuff like that.
What I liked about the characterization of both those characters in Godzilla vs. Kong is that, you know, they both kind of kept to Godzilla's whole thing with the Monsterverse. I think his personality is very much guy who's like on the edge of retirement. Like from the start in Godzilla, he's just like, oh, you're calling me up. I did this like 50 years ago or whatever. Now you're calling me back. I was sitting there watching my stories and under the water. And then he just keeps getting called back to fucking get rid of Titans. And he's like, oh, fuck, fine. Okay, I'll clock back in. And versus Kong, who feels very much like a lot more lackadaisical. Like, he'll get to his job.
Yeah, he wakes up late, you know, Yeah, and I like the kind of like attempts at kind of this personality. Like Kong's a bit annoyed, or especially as we get to like mini Kong later on. Like he's just really like just not having it, which I really love. I think it's really fun, and I think like you talked a lot about, you kind of teased earlier like the kind of idea of like the weight of these characters in terms of like the effects and everything. And it is, I think, interesting, like, despite, like, we could talk about kind of the visuals of the movie in a bit, but I think, I just kept thinking, like, it's interesting that we've kind of gotten to a point where we can have, like, Godzilla and Kong so casually almost in a movie and have them just be very, like, lazy and stuff like that. After, like, especially, like, in the Peter Jackson one, it was, like, this big effort. It's an Andy Serkis performance, stuff like that. I just think it's
versus also the Roland Emmerich Godzilla of the 90s, the original American Godzilla,
right,
which you haven't seen yet.
I have not yet, but I'll get to it.
Interesting kind of contrast to that as well, in terms of the history of American Godzilla movies, because I was around. That was the first Godzilla I saw in the theater, was the 90s Godzilla at a drive-in.
And how was it?
I remember really loving it. I had a toy of the Godzilla from that. That was like one of my childhood favorite toys. Also radio remote controlled. It was cool. That movie doesn't hold up very well necessarily. I think there is no MonsterVerse movie worse than that one. But I also don't think it's the worst Godzilla movie. But we'll maybe talk about that at some other point. So with the MonsterVerse though, yeah, I just think as we get to Godzilla X Kong, it feels very much like this franchise is kind of like being a bit more loose, I would say, in some of the earlier films. Even like Godzilla vs. Kong, I would say that a strength of that movie, quite frankly, is that the human scenes are bad, but they're much quicker in Godzilla vs. Kong, I would argue. There's a bit better pace than X, I would say. I think this movie is not too much longer than that one, but it's not as, I think, evenly keeled with, I mean, while trying to do so much more in a way that, I appreciate the ambition, but also it is just kind of like, I don't know if we can handle this much in an American Godzilla movie.
Well, yeah, and I mean, like, this is the thing, I think, with this movie. I think, obviously, with versus Kong, it's the MonsterVerse kind of moving into this more silly, kind of goofier tone. Tongue-in-cheek, and it kind of, it knows how goofy and silly it is.
I would argue King of the Monsters tried to do that. It was an unsuccessful transition.
I think it tries to do it with the human elements. I think, like...
Bradley Whitford and Thomas Middleditch saying, like, King Gonorrhea, I believe is a joke.
Some of the worst jokes in that movie. That there's, like, one good joke, though, where Kyle Chandler's like, I need someone to go with me to the thing. And I think, like, Thomas Middleditch is like, I'll go. And he's like, anyone else? Which I think that's pretty funny, I think. But yeah, like, all of the jokes in that movie are so bad. Like, really, really terrible, terrible jokes.
Not also immune with Godzilla vs. Kong, where you got pretty much like Julian Dennison and Brian Tyree Henry, who Tyree Henry also returns because we needed him. Because why did we need him again? Because Rachel comes over to him after, like, look, my daughter's feeling all weird, and, like, you must know the key to this, or something, right? Because you're a conspiracy theorist podcaster who's a great character that we should all love.
Yeah. I mean, it's so upsetting. We talked a little bit about this, but, like, I love Brian Tyree Henry. I think he is maybe one of the best actors working today. Whether you look at, like, his Atlanta performance or his performance, like his voice performance in the Spider-Verse movies, or
Causeway, which he was nominated for an Oscar for, was
he's
very good performance.
If Beale Street Could Talk, which he's unbelievably good in.
But he's also Surprise in that movie, which I love. When he shows up, like, late, and he's like, oh shit,
yes,
it's Brian Tyree Henry.
But, like, he gets kind of cast in the past few years as, like, comic relief characters, which he kind of is in Eternals, although that movie's putting it more on, like, Kumail Nanjiani, and
he also gets to have, like, the the one kind of, like, openly gay relationship that's been in a Marvel movie so far.
That's,
like,
true,
explicitly.
But then he's in, like, Bullet Train, which is, like,
terrible use of him.
Fully just a comedic relief performance, which is so bad. And he's in these movies, and it's it's very weird because he's an actor who can do so much dramatically and just without even saying a lot.
And also comedically, he can be very funny as well.
He can be very funny, especially like on Atlanta. He's very funny, and like his one scene in like Beale Street is just some of the best dramatic acting I've ever seen in my life.
Yes.
Like, yeah, and so it's a little upsetting that he gets cast as like in this type of role, and I think like because he's given a lot of that comedic relief, and he's given a lot of the really admittedly still bad jokes. Like they haven't like fixed a lot of like the jokes from King of the Monsters. Like they're still just like really not funny to me.
But at the same time, you know what? Also, those three characters who were probably my least favorite things about the movie, one of my favorite elements of versus Kong, which is like the King Ghidorah skull that they use to like telepathically link themselves to Mechagodzilla. It's like what was Damien Bashir,
yes,
the evil guy, and like there's that whole thing where it's the one guy who I believe is supposed to be like Ken Watanabe's son, I believe.
Man.
Shun Iguri as Ren Serizawa.
Yes.
Was,
okay. So it's
Yes, the name. Yeah.
Weird.
Wild.
What a weird choice.
Yeah. But anyway, at least I still like though that because he's the one who like wears the VR set basically that connects him with King Ghidorah and allows like him to basically like pilot Mechagodzilla until the connection gets lost, and then Mechagodzilla's on his own. And I think that's a fun detail. That feels kind of like a fun continuity detail in line with like in Showa, because you've seen a fair amount of the Showa movies. They would occasionally have like a weird continuity thing left over, like one of the Mothras died or whatever, or this is what happened to King Ghidorah's skull. Like just a little detail that I think actually helps build the universe a bit up, and I love the look of it and the weird neonness. I wish Bryan Tyree Henry didn't say, if this wasn't ecologically awful, it would be a great DJ booth.
Right, yeah, exactly.
It's worst thing.
It's that kind of. It's also just those kinds of jokes where like, there's some of them that are genuinely like a thing we talk about a lot of like, jokes that break up the tension of a scene and just kind of undermine the kind of actual drama of what's going on. There's a bit of that
happens, or he's behind me, isn't he?
Right. Well, but like, a lot of them are just genuinely just bad gags, like just really bad like. Not funny jokes that kind of land with a thud, I think.
This isn't just a problem of the jokes, but also of the exposition in all of these sequels to the 2014 Godzilla and the Monsterverse. Some of the worst fucking ADR of any modern movies. Especially that are like that big a budget. In King of the Monsters, that's like part of the death nail of it. It's just like every other line is ADR'd, whether someone's visible or not on screen. And it just feels like so stilted. Far more stilted than any American dub of an older Godzilla movie.
It's true, actually.
Yeah, it's interesting, but especially when he has to share some of the comedic relief with our boy, our fave.
Okay, well, yeah.
The man of the hour, in our opinion, who is your background currently, Dan Stevens, who is also in this film, previously starred in The Guest, a great actor that we're both big fans of.
Yeah, and what's his name in this movie, Thomas? Has he got a normal name, like Steve or... Bob.
Well, Stevens is part of his regular name, so Dan's very common, so naturally he would be named Trapper.
Yeah.
It's such a bummer, because the way that Dan Stevens introduced Bryan, tell the people, maybe they didn't see, like, how is Dan Stevens introduced? What is his character?
So he's like, he's a vet, right? That's his, like, official title, I guess.
Right.
And he's introduced, Kong has a little toothache. Relatable.
Wonderful, also. Like, exactly what I want Kong to have a worry of, like, fuck, my tooth's weird.
I kind of think it's funny. I think it adds a lot of, like, personality, yeah.
That's the thing, yeah. It's just like, he's gotta go back up from Hollowworth for a dentist appointment. And Dan Stevens, and how does he get rid of that big old tooth?
Also, they get, like, gosh, what would you even call it? Like, it's a ship that, like, has essentially a big, like... What would you call the thing that he clasps?
It's like a crane thing.
Like a crane.
It's kind of, yeah. It's like a big crane thing where they're like pulling it out with like these giant pliers, basically.
Yes, yeah.
That he harnessed on because he like prized them onto Kong's tooth very hard, and they pull it out, and he has a song playing, which at least I remember. It's not a very like well-known song. It's a "Gotcha" by Greenfly. Fun song, and it was a fun bit. And I'm like, this is a cool like, especially. This is what I want out of these fucking movies. Something that I love about the Showa era and even like any era Godzilla honestly that does this well, is the weird shit that's just going on when you have monsters, kaiju. You gotta have somebody who's like, I can, help him with his teeth. Or
Yes.
do a surgery, in theory. Like, you'd make so much fucking money off that. Just do that with a giant-ass ape, and he's, getting rid of the tooth, and that song plays, and it's such a charm. Dan Stevens gets to use his, British accent, and he gets to be super charming.
Yeah, he sounds like he's British, but sometimes he sounds a bit Australian. But it's a really like great sort of energy he's bringing to this movie.
My comment on it, I think you agreed when we walked out, was that Carrie Elwes coded.
Yes, very Carrie Elwes. And like, yeah, this is exactly what I want to see of like, because especially with King of the Monsters, like there's too much. You're putting way too much character on this, right? When I have to think about like, okay, so Kyle Chandler and Vera Farmiga were married, but they're not. They had a son. Did we meet him in the, like that kind of stuff? It really
too
gets
many
to be too
bodies
much.
left unfucking crumbled by giant skyscrapers. Because like my biggest complaint with the human element of these movies is, in theory, I would love if you had a star-studded Godzilla movie, but the thing is, you need to play them, I would argue, mostly, except for maybe like a couple main characters, just play a couple as like Muppet cameos, where they're gonna come in, and it's like, you gotta establish, I don't know, like some famous person's like running a coffee shop, and Godzilla attacks, and it's just like, oh no. I'm not leaving my coffee shop. My father owned this coffee shop. His father before him. I'm not leaving. And then Godzilla just destroys, I don't know, Steve Martin doing that. Or something. That's, like, if you were a famous person and you're like, hey, you want to be in a Godzilla movie? It's like, well, do I get killed by Godzilla? In a fun way.
True.
That's how you want to go. And there are elements of that, just not with celebrities. Like, my favorite example is the Rodan sequence in King of the Monsters. I think a standout sequence of that entire movie. Where the guy is like in the plane, he's like, I gotta eject myself, and he ejects himself directly into Rodan's mouth.
That's so much fun. Yes.
Yeah.
And like that, I think that's a really great way of doing like the human characters. Or I think you just need to make them, I think, broad enough to where you need to give me enough that I care about them, but not too much like in King of the Monsters where I have to like do like math to figure out like, do I know this character? Should I know this character? And also, I don't care about, like, Millie Bobby Brown being, like, I don't know, just conflicted because her mom wants to, like, destroy the world.
And another thing is, like, now, Bryan, you've seen a few of, like, the Showa-era Godzilla movies. You can at least say that, like, while, like you mentioned, they're not very detailed characters. At the very least, the best ones have your human characters doing something interesting.
Yes.
Doesn't have to connect that much to Godzilla, honestly. Like, in my favorite example is Ghidorah, the Three-Headed Monster. That movie does a lot of shit, but it's all just very casually done. Like, oh, who's this woman that showed up looking like a fucking Newsies kid from Disney's Newsies, starring Christian Bale. And it turns out she's from Venus, and there's also, like, gangsters who are trying to, like, assassinate somebody. Like, all that shit's going on while other kaiju things are going on. That's, like, the ideal to me.
Yeah.
Just have, like, a fun story related by proximity to the fucking kaiju, you know?
Yeah. And I feel like they try to do that in The New Empire, where it's, like, this kind of group of, like, Dan Stevens, Rebecca Hall, Brian Tyree Henry, her daughter, and then, like, the pilot character. We'll get to him. I think he's great. But, of, like, them kind of fit, like, what's going on in Hollow Earth, like, stuff like that. But I think, yeah, it is kind of too closely tied to what Kong is doing. It's a lot of just like, whoa, what's going on? What's Kong doing? Oh, he needs to do this. And like, this movie is like almost 2 hours or so. And like most of those Showa era movies like don't even hit 100 minutes. No. And they're doing it in like 90 minutes. And I think if you gave me something like this of like, pare down these characters just like to their just like bare characteristics, maybe don't make Brian Tyree Henry like he's like filming every scene on his like camcorder and like
like his DV cam bullshit.
Yeah,
it's terrible. He's a podcaster just to document everything.
Yeah,
as we do in our daily lives. If you follow our social media feeds, we just tell you everything about ourselves.
Exactly. It's such a weird like characterization, and like it's interesting on paper where it's like a lot of those Showa era characters are like journalists, like people who work like offices and stuff like that. It feels like a natural progression. Like, well, how do we make like a modern like journalist? Like, make it a podcaster. That's interesting and modern and stuff. But like, it's a miscalculation of just like how to make this character interesting or funny, and yeah, it doesn't work.
Unlike David Gordon Green with the Halloween movies, I would argue. I like those podcasters in the 2010s. Just they're perfect like murder victims for Michael Myers to like break in with.
Yeah. And I mean like when you were talking about like kind of the other characters in the Showa movies, I watched Invasion of Astro Monster today. Yes. And there's a character in that movie called Glenn who is like great, and I care more about him and him dealing with like, you know, he falls in love with a girl. Oh no, she's from Planet X. It's goofy and it's silly and it's not quite like as detailed as this or anything.
Yeah, played by Nick Adams, an American actor who did a lot of work in Japan.
Yes. But like he's a lot of fun in that movie, and I think that character is like he's way more interesting, and like when he pops up on screen I'm like, it's Glenn, and I'm happier to see him when in this it's like, oh, there's Brian Tyree Henry. Yeah, he's going off about his like blog and how he's like losing followers or whatever.
Or having a staring contest match with the
Iwa,
yeah, one of the Iwa natives, yes. And just doing such dumb shit. It's a shame, especially when, to contrast this, we kind of referenced this a bit earlier. I want to talk about a bit Monarch, Legacy of Monsters, which I watched the pilot episode of, at least the first one, Aftermath is what it's called. And that episode starts off in an interesting, well, initially, spoilers for like the first few, like 10 to 15 minutes of this episode. It starts off with John Goodman from Kong Skull Island.
Oh, okay.
And he has like this giant briefcase that he's carrying around on the island. Like, this is right before he dies after getting eaten by skull crawlers in Kong Skull Island. And he throws this thing into the ocean after he's being chased by like a giant spider he thinks is going to eat him, but then a giant crab comes out of the water because they're at like in the rocks on the bay, and the spider and the crab kill each other and he moves on. But he threw the briefcase into the water, and then like in 2013 it's found. And then in 2014 we see a bit of footage from Godzilla 2014, and our main character here, new character played by Anna Sawa, plays Kate, who was a San Francisco school teacher who has PTSD from being on one of the school buses on like the bridge in San Francisco from the 2014 movie.
Right, okay.
This episode though takes place in 2015 after her father dies. So it's been a year since San Francisco. So she's getting on the plane. There's the cool world building detail of like when she's on the plane, these guys come out in hazmat suits on the plane, and they're like, we're going to spray you all before we arrive just to make sure there's no chance of kaiju viruses or whatever. And somebody next to her's like, whatever, this is a joke. This is bullshit. And then she gets in a taxi cab, and a guy in Japan and is going like to this address that her father gave her. The guy talks about how like, oh, you know, San Francisco was staged, and it was actually like done with CGI. And she's just like, oh, that's interesting information. That's a revelation. And then she arrives at this apartment, realizes like the key that works, and she opens the door, and it's this entire like little family apartment with a bunch of pictures of her father, but with a different family. And then the mother and the son, who's like an adult around the same age as her, come out, and they're like, who are you? What are you doing here? We don't know you. They are her dead father's secret family, and he was like absentee and wasn't around all the time because he had a separate family in Japan while he was doing like kaiju research. Because they go into a closet in the apartment and they open up a safe, and it's the briefcase.
Oh, okay.
Which is a really cool setup, I think. That's actually like engaging because you deal with that human drama, but also like they have a Godzilla drill in the middle of all that, and they have to go into the subway. They don't know if it's real or not, and there's like tension, and then there's a false alarm. But there's plenty of kaiju. You see Godzilla during that early attack, and there's some other kaiju related stuff. There's also like the big gimmick of this show is the Wyatt Russell and Kurt Russell casting.
Hell yeah.
My episode only had Wyatt.
No Kurt.
Right, because this is all stuff like all the scenes with that character take place in the past.
Oh, sure, right.
There's no Kurt scenes. Maybe he's in the second episode. I don't know. I might watch it because I liked it solidly enough. There's enough kaiju things that happen, especially with like that stuff, which is weaker than like the human drama stuff that's going on in like 2015. But at the same time, it's enough like, okay, this could be an interesting way to world build like Monarch, which I do like as an idea in these movies, right?
Yeah.
Like having like, oh, there's a secret division of the government that's only about getting Godzilla information. Just all these scientists like Rebecca Hall. Like, that's not a bad setup, especially, I don't know, maybe make Brian Tyree Henry one of those guys instead of a fucking podcaster conspiracy theorist dude. Like, we're not offended by the podcaster. It's more the conspiracy theory guy.
It's just such a weird way of handling, like, his character, I still think. And, like, you made a good point of, like, why not just make him one of, like, Rebecca Hall's, like, scientist buddies? And, like, it's weird to add the kind of conspiracy theory thing and, like, just the whole characterization. I'm just like, this is not interesting, or, like, it's not funny. It's not, it's nothing. It's nothing, I think.
Yes, and on an unrelated note, one of the co-writers of Godzilla X Kong, Terry Rossio,
Yes,
who I told you about, wrote on the original American Godzilla in 1990. He has a story by credit for that, along with, like, he worked on Pirates of the Caribbean and both the Antonio Banderas Mask of Zorro movies.
Aladdin,
that's true, yes. The Lone Ranger, along with Ted Elliott, who he wrote a lot of those with. And then he's been doing these two Godzilla movies, despite the fact that I just want to mention trivia about Rossio. I'm just going to read this verbatim from Wikipedia. On November 23rd, 2018, Rossio expressed his condolences to parents of vaccine-damaged children. However, he likened the term to anti-vax to a slur equivalent to the N-word.
No.
But he didn't say that specific phrasing of it.
He said the word.
Yep, he wrote that down
no.
in a tweet, I believe. So he gets to work in Hollywood still.
Yeah, and we've been talking about this like a bunch of just how weird it is to include like the Hollow Earth conspiracy theory stuff, which is very integral to these two movies. Like, it's such a massive point.
It's setting of at least half of Godzilla X Kong.
Right, and that is just, it's insane.
That's part of my problem, I think, which we kind of talked about this, where the human stuff, a lot of it is like, where's Kong, what's Kong doing? Noticeably very distant from Godzilla and Kong, who we have to like cut away to, like, meanwhile, on the other side of Hollow Earth, or meanwhile, in Rio de Janeiro, or whatever. And I think you lose a sense of scale, which is so key to these kaiju movies. Mm-hmm. When you don't have, like, these people around. Like, that's part of what I liked about, say, Kaylee Hotzel's character, is her connection to Kong. And they barely interact in this movie at all. Which
that's
is,
true,
like, a bummer. Because, like, that's, in theory, like, the heart of what you want the movie to be. And they try and have a conversation in sign language, which I think is a cute idea introduced in that one. I think it does kind of feel to me like, look, we're going to get to this, that, like, all the King Kong stuff kind of feels like B-movie Planet of the Apes, like, Rise, Dawn.
It really
like,
is,
but,
yeah.
Which I think is part of the charm, to me, of some of that. But also, it feels very, Coke Zero. Maybe. As someone who often drinks Coke Zero when I go to the movie theater, while I was seeing this movie.
I mean, I prefer Coke Zero to Diet Coke, I'll say that much.
Diet Coke is more King of the Monsters, I would say.
Damn. I mean, my thing with the plot of this movie, I guess, is like, it's very dumb, right? It's just, it's very silly and it's very dumb. But I don't think it's silly enough. I think it's dumb. And like, if we described, like, because basically there is a in Hollow Earth, there is like an uncharted territory that Kong is kind of exploring a bit more. He's kind of, trying to figure out what's up there, because there is an evil, bad monkey.
The Scar King.
The Scar King. And he controls not only the other apes, right? Like, tells them what to do. He's like their,
he's mining for, like, volcanic igneous rock, I think.
Right, whatever. But he controls this, like... I was trying to figure out how to describe this. Like, he's like a frost dog hybrid of, like, a dinosaur as well, kind of.
That kaiju has a name. Shimo.
Okay. My apologies to Shimo. He controls him with a crystal that he has on the end of a of a bone whip, which should be cooler than I think it is. But like the thing about like the plot of this movie is it is very dumb, and it's you know, dumb stuff happens in this movie. I just don't think it's like, I don't think it's silly enough. You know, like a lot like
No.
I think a lot of the like the comedic bits and a lot of the jokes are either the comic relief stuff with the humans, which never lands.
Especially, sadly, with Dan Stevens. That's what his
Yes.
character becomes as it gradually goes along, and he's just not that funny. The only funny thing he really gets to do is something that I think is just a bad editing mistake.
Oh, yes.
Which I've told you about. Throughout the movie, there are points where Dan Stevens is piloting his ship, and they'll cut to, like, a shot of him, like, looking from right and looking adjacent to camera, like, in profile, and just being like,
He lets out like a woohoo like kind of thing as well.
But no, they use the exact same clip, at least I think 3 or 4 times for the second half of this movie.
Yeah. I mean, and like, there's comedic stuff I think with like them fighting. I mean, maybe the best part of the entire movie is when Kong finds like a little monkey, a little mini Kong, and the mini Kong is like kind of getting away from him. He goes to like the mini Kong has like a dad or an uncle, like a guardian of some kind, whatever. And Kong gets into a fight with them, and he uses the mini Kong as like a weapon and like whips him around and just starts hitting people with it. And that's the kind of bit where I'm like, oh, this is really funny, and this is the kind of energy that I wish this movie had a bit more of. I wish it was more over the top and goofy and silly. And it does have that a little bit, but it you don't get it for the entire runtime, I don't think. You get it in short bursts. It just doesn't work.
I also think Kong and Suko, by the way, is the name of the juvenile Titan ape.
Right.
Suko, I think they have like a solid kind of like adopted family relationship, which, you know, it's kind of similar weirdly to Son of Godzilla. I don't know if you've seen that one yet.
I have not. I think it's my next one, though.
Yeah, it's an introduction of Minya, who would also go by Manila and Little Godzilla, various different names over the course of the series. Godzilla, like, throws him around a lot in Son of Godzilla. There's kind of, like, he's not a very, like, comforting, warm father figure, Godzilla, shockingly, in the early to mid-Showa era. This is around the time he started becoming more of a hero, but he still kind of had an attitude. Kind of like he does in this movie, I would argue. I think when... The trouble with Godzilla, I think, does take a back seat. This is much more of a Kong movie.
Oh, yeah. Should
Yes.
be Kong x Godzilla, but that doesn't really roll off the tongue as easily.
You know what? He fought for above Godzilla billing, and it just wouldn't happen. Godzilla
Yeah.
has good reps.
That's true.
Like, he just won an
I
Oscar.
was gonna say he won an Oscar. Like he's got the Academy Award winner Godzilla and Kong hasn't won an Oscar yet.
No. You know, not every Oscar winner has a great immediate follow-up. This is kind of like his, like his, not his Norbit. It's not that bad. But it's just kind of like, ooh, right off the heat of the Oscar. What's this, buddy? Huh.
Yeah. Well, because like the whole Godzilla plot point, which is like, it's completely separate from like the Kong stuff for the majority of it, where Godzilla is like, he's guzzling up like radiation basically, and he's going to like power plants. He's going to like the bottom of the ocean to fight like the original Titan or something. Like it's
Right.
It's a bit fuzzy, and like again, it sounds like it should be interesting, and I kind of like the fight that they have with that like sea monster under the like water and whatever, but I don't know. It's just not that interesting for some reason. I don't know.
There's a point shortly after they introduce the Scar King, who I think is fun. Like, we kind of referenced him earlier. I think is, like, fun as, like, a B-villain. He's got more of an orangutan kind of design, and, like, it works for, like, the way his hands hang and stuff like that.
He's got a bit of anime vibes going on.
Right. That's not inaccurate. But I think that works, I think, and especially when, like, you know, they have to, like, face off after a certain point, because this movie, like, lulls after that guy's introduced, because they don't have him for a while. They have that one, like, henchman ape, who I don't know the name of, who's kind of, like, the main toady of Scar, who's, like, kind of balding. He initially was, like, part of the group that tried to get Godzilla, that tried to get King Kong, but, you know, one of those guys got killed, and the other guy got the rock thrown, which is pretty great.
Again, that's the kind of stuff where I'm like, this is the energy this movie kind of needs. And I like that chase where like he's kind of like luring them into the traps, and like he's like a prepper. Like he's got like, you know, his like
Home Alone energy.
Yeah, he's like, so if they try to get me, I got things set up. I like that stuff. I think it's a lot of fun, and like you get like, yeah, just like the monsters falling down like big holes and just kind of like trap doors, stuff like that. It's very fun.
Anti-gravity at one point, which I thought was a really good sequence.
Yeah, and I think like because like you mentioned earlier, kind of the way that these characters kind of feel in terms of like their weight on screen, and like I don't think Wingard has a good sense of that necessarily.
Not as much in X Kong. I think it's a downgrade.
Yeah,
versus
because like I mean, this one really feels like he's playing with like toys kind of thing. You know, there's not a lot of like grounded like weight to the way that these characters feel. It is very like kid playing with their toys, just like.
Well, hold on. I think there's a distinction. That's my thing. Is that both of them have that same energy, but my distinction, I would argue, would be Godzilla versus Kong feels like you're watching at least a creative child do like these monster battles, because stuff like my shoulder's out, and then like, oh, I'm gonna bend it. Like that at least feels like, once again, like that's a bit more creative, and like a kid actually gives a shit about like plotting it out, almost storyboarding it in his dumb way.
Right.
Versus just this movie is a lot more of just like clanging together.
Yes. If part of your set piece is Godzilla and Kong fighting at the pyramids of Egypt, that sounds great,
right,
and it sounds really like amazing. But I don't know. It is, I think, because there's just not a lot of weight to these characters in terms of like their models, their character models.
And also, I think a big key thing in sequences like that and like the Rio battle, not as much with like the CG sets, because, you know, a big part of these movies is seeing these, you know, giant monsters destroy practical fucking models for the longest time. And then even like we've seen great CG, we just talked about -1. Mm-hmm. Like you can do really great stuff, and even, like I said, versus Kong, I think has some fun stuff like that. And this just feels a lot more like weightless, but also it's bright, but to a degree that's not like the overcorrection, I would argue, where like in versus Kong, there's a lot more differentiation of lighting. Like that dusk thing happens with like the initial battle. It's on the carrier. It's like as the sun's setting, and there's the neon like Hong Kong stuff, and even the Mechagodzilla battle I think is well staged. It's just, in this one, it all is like even lit in the most like bland way possible, to where there's no definition really to the characters.
You're right, 100%. Because I was talking with someone about this, and I was like, it's real dumb. Like I just didn't really like. I didn't have a lot to say about it really, and they kind of asked me like, does it at least look good? Like, is the CGI good? And I'm like, it looks good. It looks fine, but like, yeah, it's a bit bland looking. I don't know. And there's a lot of like, I think, interesting kind of. I think the colors are really cool when they get to like the village, like the Iwa village. And that has a lot of like, that also has a lot of the cool kind of neon lighting as well, kind of as they get more into like that cave and stuff like that. But yeah, it isn't, it's weirdly enough, yeah, not a problem that a lot of movies have nowadays of like, it's too dark. It just doesn't look
it's too
that
light.
Interesting. Yeah.
It's really just true light, in a way where like it's a bummer, because I liked a lot of the designs for the monsters that were in this Monsterverse era. Like we started off with like, you know, the big chonky Godzilla in 2014, which rules. I think that's a great way of doing it. Especially if I've seen a few people cosplay with like practical versions of that suit.
That's cool.
And it really rules, like a Dragon Con and shit like that. It's always great to see when somebody pulls it off so well. But yeah, you notice that there's been like kind of a gradual redesign, tweaking through the Monsterverse movies up to this one, I would say, right? So really, like, he looks a lot different by here, X Kong.
There's nothing wrong with his design. I actually kind of like that he changes color. Like he's like blue,
right?
And then throughout the movie he changes to pink. And I like the shade of pink. It's a really cool like design change for him as well.
Happy Easter, by the way. We saw this on Easter Sunday. We didn't mention that.
Yeah, we did.
That's when we watched this. We prayed to our Godzilla.
But yeah, I don't know. There's something about his design, I think, besides like the pink and like, you know, he's kind of glowing a bit, right, with the kind of pink hue. But like, I don't know. They have kind of sanded him down, especially when you have -1, which just came out, and that is such a unique and like gnarly design for Godzilla, whereas this feels a bit clean and a bit like, you know, and like just all the scenes with him like running also just feel like what we were talking about before. Like he has no weight to him. It doesn't. It feels like this is a toy. It doesn't feel like it's actually like this massive monster or anything like that.
Which is the problem with Hollow Earth, like I mentioned, as a setting,
Yes.
just because there's not a lot of scale to that. So it just all feels kind of like relative in a way where it's like, oh yeah, you're kind of removing part of the fun.
Yeah.
Of these things, which, you know, another problem of like separating. But we do at least get to cut away. Oh boy, and we get just killer stuff, right? Like, let's talk about some of the comedic relief. What's a wonderful comedic relief line you just couldn't stop laughing at, Brian?
God, there's some in here that I think I genuinely was like, woof, like, you know, like, oh, that one was just. But I'm really trying to think of them because they are just that kind of comedic relief where you don't laugh, it lands with a huge thud, and you just forget about it.
It's really the staring contest, I think, is the one where he's like staring at him, like, oh, do I have to keep staring at him? Do I have to, like, it's shit like that where I'm going to be very, very frank about the evolution of this character type. This doesn't feel too distant of the various different past versions of, like, oh, a dorky dude who does something with technology, who's a nerd and whatever. This isn't too distant from, like, Anthony Anderson in the first Transformers.
Yeah, it feels like a Michael Bay character in a bad way. I love a lot of Michael Bay's movies, but without
at least the distinctive cynical edge of Michael Bay.
Yes, right.
As opposed to, like, here where it just feels kind of, like, generic and without any kind of soul or imperfections or any traits at all.
Yeah, it really is just, like, bland comic relief. It's there, obviously, because if we're spending time with these characters, I think you do kind of want them to have some kind of personality, and I'm sure Adam Wingard is like, well, let's have him be funny because this movie's fun. It's, you know, it's got a very fun, light energy to it, right? Where
his best movies have a really interesting sense of humor.
Exactly. Yes. The guest is so funny, and like this,
and so is Your Next. Weirdly, that's kind of the fun surprise of that movie. Yeah. It's very much a dark comedy.
Yes, and this it has none of that, and it doesn't even have his, like, you know, because he has a kind of a bit of a kind of darker sense of humor, right? Especially with, like, some of the stuff in Your Next is just like, Jesus, this is, like, ridiculous.
You know what? I'm gonna say right here, missed opportunity. One of the things where I was kind of like, oh, is something maybe horror-driven going to happen? The bit where Dan Stevens just lets a mosquito on Hollow Earth inject its nozzle in and suck some blood out. He's like, he needs it more than I do. The moment that happened in a split second, I'm like, are they going to do, like, a horror thing where, like, Dan Stevens gets, like, a horrible disease on Hollow Earth and, like, dies rapidly?
Well, I will say, the one Adam Wingard moment I think that feels really good is with Alex Ferns, who actually, like, has been popping up in a lot of stuff. Like, he's in The Batman. He's in he's in Wrath of Man. He was in Chernobyl. Yeah, like, and he's an Andor, of course.
Yes.
And, like, his character has a really great also energy of just like, fuck you, I'm in charge. And his death is, like, the one great, like, Adam Wingard moment where I'm like, oh yeah, Adam Wingard made this movie where he just dies in the most, like, split second surprising, like, oh my, what the fuck was that? He got eaten by a tree. And then Brian Tyree Henry says he got eaten by a tree like 5 more times because he really needs to, like, hammer that joke down that he got eaten.
Because Dan Stevens doesn't react to it that much. Just like, oh wow, that was whopper or whatever, and he's just like, just saw a guy get eaten by a tree. What's the matter with you?
It's the kind of the kind of, well, that happened kind of moment, which again, it's like that moment is so genuinely made me, like, you know, kind of like, that was great, like, oh, that's so funny, and then it's immediately undercut by just the really bad comedy.
But what about the intense drama? Do you have that for Rebecca Hall and Kaylee Hottel as they struggle with, like, oh, her adopted mother, will she be able to let her go?
I actually like their scene at the end where she's just like, look, I get it if you want to go, like, I get it. It's actually kind of a much better version of this kind of plot point. Like, I could see this plot point being like, I could see there being more conflict with Rebecca Hall's character where she's like, oh, but I raised you, I'm your mother, and you know, you don't know these people kind of thing, which I think they very smartly, like, avoid. And I like their kind of final scene together. It's actually, it's quite sweet, but, like, it's very weird to be in this movie. And I think the rest of the movie has just not given you any of that kind of dramatic weight at all. And so it's just kind of weird to be like, oh, I'm thrust into this like emotionally sweet scene. It doesn't feel right almost. I don't know. But...
especially when a lot of their earlier scenes kind of pale in comparison to, I don't think it's like them meeting in Godzilla versus Kong is like anything revelatory, but it's functional. I think it works.
Sure.
I think in particular, I will say one of the funnier moments in Godzilla versus Kong is the bit where Skarsgård, after getting nothing to do most of the movie, like as they're about to charge up Kong, he like kneels down to Kaylee Halden and tries to sign like, "You're a brave little girl," and he's just signing coward. Yeah. And then she signs just like "No, you," and he's like, "Well, maybe we both are." It's a really funny bit. Yeah. It's like the one really funny bit of that movie. That's the thing where like you see peaks of like what could be interesting characters. Like if you let Alexander Skarsgård be like a fun kind of like dumb himbo type, as like this guy, or if you let like occasionally they have Rebecca Hall say some kind of a joke, or do like her version of it is just like smiling or like, oh, what? Rebecca Hall, like, really want to emphasize Rebecca Hall, one of our most talented actresses working today. Yeah, I think an incredible performer. If you've seen especially her recent horror movies like The Night House and Resurrection, especially, I think she's fucking amazing in both of those movies. But yeah, just in these Hollywood movies like this, and sadly Iron Man 3, she's the biggest flaw of otherwise perfect Iron Man 3. She got her role cut basically by Avi Arad. You know that story, right?
Oh, is that what happened?
Like, for merchandising reasons, he's just like, they won't want a girl villain toy, the boys. So she's like got cut out of that movie basically last second.
Oh, that sucks. She's pretty good in that movie too. I think like
whenever she's used in it.
Yeah. I mean, she's such a great actor, and like obviously like. I kind of mentioned this, like, I'm hoping that this and being in Godzilla versus Kong and stuff just kind of helps her, like, direct more stuff, like, I think that is kind of what she wants to do, and I'm here for that. I just, it does suck that she does have to kind of be in these movies, and, again, just get saddled with saying, like, just dumb lines and dumb, like, exposition dumps and dumb, like, jokes and stuff like that. It's just not giving her a lot to do, unfortunately.
Especially when you consider like she's been like even in worse movies and less utilized. Like the sin to me is she is the love interest of Holmes and Watson.
Fuck, I haven't seen that movie.
I watched that for the Double H Double Bill show. One of the worst movies we talked about in that era. Ray Fiennes is Moriarty in that, by the way. Anyway,
oh, that's cool.
But he's in that one though. That's the thing. Rebecca Hall or Ray Fiennes in a fucking Sherlock Holmes movie. Sure. Who's Holmes and Watson? Not even the good comedy version of that.
Yeah, gosh. God, I wish the movie was good too, because it is like Farrell and John C. Reilly getting together again. Ugh.
Remember the whole thing where like that movie was offered to Netflix and they didn't want to release it? They said, no, we're not doing that.
That's funny.
That's how low the bar was for Holmes and Watson.
God, even Netflix didn't want it. And they'll fucking take anything.
I want to ask about, we haven't talked much about this because we saw this together, Brian, on a Dolby screen, as we mentioned previously. How did you feel about the theatrical presentation of it? Was it a fun screening to you?
It was fine. I think the energy was just like, it was like people were watching like a UFC fight. Like it was, and like people clapped at the end of this movie. Like that is, it got a like unanimous like, applause from the entire theater.
I want to shout out the guy who sat next to me. This is when you were in the bathroom early on, but we sat next to each other, but you left. And this guy who was next to me, who had bought the King Kong cup from the AMC, and he looked at my shirt. I wore my classic Godzilla 1954 shirt. Usually when I see theatrical Godzilla screenings, because I'm a cool person. And he's like, hey man, cool shirt. And I'm like, hey, cool cup. And he's like, ah.
Wow.
We had a moment together. It was fun.
I wasn't there to witness it.
No. But the end of the screening, the first thing I heard him say to his girlfriend is like, yo, we need to watch more Godzilla movies. And if it's doing that much, if people are more inclined to watch Godzilla, because that's, like I mentioned, it was kind of an origin point for why I watched all those fucking movies. It was like, I don't know, this is coming. Might as well make it an excuse. Thanks also to, we haven't mentioned them yet, but the Criterion channel streaming service is coming very much in handy. This particular thing. Yeah, I think with Godzilla X Kong, it's a trouble of, like I mentioned, they're stuffing too much into this. We've talked so much about like all the different characters that are human, all the different monsters, and I think it's kind of like it's almost a one thing imbalance with both the humans and the monsters. It's Bryan Tyree Henry for the humans, and I mean, I would kind of argue of like the other ones, it's probably like the little mini Konsuko, who I don't think is terrible, but at the same time it's just transparently just like, okay, we're having a, you know, son of Kong kind of thing. He's cute, but at the same time, even like with the bit you talked about earlier, like him being thrown around and stuff, I don't think that's a funny and well-timed gag, but it also does completely break the reality of like, this kid's gonna be fine. Like, he's indestructible, basically.
Right, yeah.
If you get used as a fucking, like, you know, a purse to, like, throw at people to hit them with, it kind of loses a bit of that suspense. But at the same time, yeah, their relationship's fun. There's the bit where, like, he kills that one, like, sea creature on Hollow
Very
Earth.
cool. Yeah.
And then he, like, is eating it and eating the gooey, a lot of goo in this movie,
Very
various
gooey
different
movie.
shades. Felt very Nick 90s splat, you know, getting slimed.
Yes.
Kind of thing. Wonderful time to be referencing that. But the little bit where he like is eating the big serpent, and then Sonic Kong comes over just like, can I have some? And he's like, you want it? Here, he breaks off a little piece, and he's like, you want it? Just fucking take it. He doesn't even give it to him. He
Like, throws it on the ground.
That personality, I think that's very much still here with the characters. I've said this much. You agree with that, with Godzilla and Kong? Do they feel consistent over these MonsterVerse movies to you?
I mean, a little bit. I think I like the kind of goofier bits that they are going for with in terms of their personality. Like, I like when Kong is just kind of like, like he does one of those, like, then like smile. Yeah. Like, I like that kind of stuff. But I don't know. It is just kind of like how I feel about this movie overall is just kind of like almost ambivalent in a weird way, which is weird because like I'm watching those Showa era movies. I'm really into them, and I'm really into just, you know, Godzilla and the history of Godzilla and what we can do with this character. But like, this movie really just didn't make me feel anything. Almost, I like Kong in this movie. I do actually, and I like his personality. But like I said, with the mini Kong and when he defeats like the giant sea serpent thing, and yeah, I like that stuff. But again, like, I think Godzilla doesn't get enough of that necessarily, despite curling up in the Coliseum, which is really great, I think. But it's got me feeling quite just kind of meh, which is weird, I guess.
I mean, look, as someone who has seen nearly every movie that has Godzilla in the title, I'll tell you right now that Godzilla X Kong currently sits on my Letterboxd list, not the Who's Tommy on Letterboxd, everybody. It's, I would say, probably about like midway through the ranking of just like the Godzilla movies.
Sure.
It's not too bad. It's nested around like Godzilla Raids Again, which I respect more for just the turnaround time, as opposed to being much of a movie, and Ebirah Horror of the Deep, which I don't think you've seen yet.
No, I think that's my next one, actually. I think that's the one I have coming up.
Get ready for Godzilla versus a giant crab.
Sounds cool. But
but yeah, so it's kind of like mid-pack. It's not necessarily like terrible to me because there's some of that infectious charm. That's a big defense a lot of people have for these movies, right? That's what I've seen from a lot of the positive reception this movie has had. Is like, it made me feel like a kid again. It made me have like that kind of fun. And I, appreciate that anybody who can feel that. That's a rare feeling to kind of have. And I've had that feeling at certain points with movies, but even with Godzilla movies. But it just definitely feels like there's, like you mentioned, there's not a lot to carry. It's like, what, it's 2 hours long, right? How long is it?
Yeah, 155.
Godzilla vs. Kong, by the way, an hour 54. So
it's about the same
only
length.
a minute shorter.
Yeah.
But I don't know, I still feel like it feels a lot smoother than this movie does. This movie feels clunky. It's paced in a very clunky way. To where, like, if I was a kid, I would be having fun with some of this stuff, but I think the human stuff would bore me. I don't think I'd hate it as much as I currently do because of how I recognize bad comedy, but also I would just be like, when are we gonna get the monsters again? I like those guys. Bring
Yeah.
them back.
I mean, this movie and versus Kong, I think, kind of both have had this energy of like, kind of what the Transformers movies had of like, at least some of the people who kind of like really love them are like, they're fun, like turn your brain off kind of movie in a way, and like, I can only do that for so much personally, and before I just start to kind of really notice just a lot of the like you said, like the clunkier elements here, and I love the kind of sillier fun moments. Like I think by the time we get to like the final battle, like I have issues with that, like I mentioned earlier, but like I'm still having a fun time, right? Like the gravity scene, which is I think a really fun way of handling like a that battle at the end.
We haven't talked about our surprise third kaiju.
I was gonna say,
because we have like we got the whole thing to where like they discovered that tribe and that allows them to use the pyramids that apparently transport them to Egypt. And Kong comes out of a wormhole and Godzilla's like, yo, you called me? What the fuck? What's up? What do you want? And then they kind of fight each other for a bit. It's like, fucking tell me, what are you trying to do?
I love the bit where Godzilla's running to Kong like full speed, like I'm gonna fucking kill you, and Kong has this like worried look on his face, like, no man, we're friends, what are you doing? No, oh he's coming.
Remember
really
the
fast.
last movie? And then they fight in the pyramids, which there's some fun stuff. I think mainly the character animation I think is still very consistent. I think throughout all of these, even as much as like the quality I think is hurt by just feels like they're stretching out the Hollow Earth stuff, especially. At the same time, there's like fun character animation to like those characters kind of like bouncing off of each other, and even like Godzilla when he fights other kaiju in this movie as well. Like the big crab thing at the beginning, that's a fun bit, especially he gets rid of that like crab lobster thing and then sleeps in the Coliseum. He had too much Italian.
Yeah, too much spaghetti.
Italian crab, the best. Crab spaghetti, the best.
It feels like a very kind of like cliche thing to say, I think, when talking about these newer American Godzilla movies, but when the monsters are on screen and they're fighting and stuff, and I've got a bag of popcorn in my hand,
yes,
and a Coke Zero, which we're not sponsored by, it's fun, and I'm having a fun time, and it's enjoyable. But I think, you have to get through so much of that human bit, of those human elements, and just all that comedy and the bad characterization and stuff like that, which I think would help if this movie, like those Showa era movies, was like 90 minutes. And we pare that stuff down. We give you some Godzilla and Kong and Mothra. We should get to Mothra. But yeah, it's bogged down by all that stuff we've been talking about.
To the degree that Mothra, who was a surprise at the end of the film,
happy
because
to see
it
her.
turns out that the we should mention like the Ewell were like they've been the tribe since Skull Island. They were originally introduced there, and then they've traveled down to the Hollow Earth. And Kaylee Hottel is one of them, and she's found her people again, and there's all that great drama we were talking about earlier. But also, it turns out that her whole destiny as sort of the great connector is to raise Mothra from the depths, which I wasn't aware of. That wasn't really in the marketing that much, anything about Mothra.
Yeah, I was genuinely, and like again, up until this point, I'm kind of like, ooh, this is getting a little rough here. And then like we get like teases of Mothra, and I'm like, oh shit, Mothra's gonna be here. This is so exciting. I love Mothra.
By the way, bringing a lot of Mothra this season, because we had her in Destroy All Monsters. We're gonna have her again next week and the week after that. So
and we're gonna have her as a guest, right?
Well, I have her right here. Mothra, you want to say anything? Add in the chirp sound effect. Good stuff. Thanks, Mothra. Great. Well, listen to her podcast.
Yeah, got great takes on movies, actually.
You must Mothra this. It's a wonderful movie podcast.
Loves
Mothra at the movies.
Mothra
Great.
at the movies.
It's a shame that got canceled because it was part of like an iHeartRadio thing, and then it just like crumbled. But yeah, I think she's pretty solid. I think she's better used here than in King of the Monsters. She is fucking like so misused, like so poorly used.
Yeah, I forgot that she just like leaves the movie for like 30-40 minutes or something, and just like isn't in the movie for some reason.
Yeah, either movie really. Like in King of the Monsters and also this one, she is at least missing for like the big climax, which is weird because she has some fun things, like the bit where she like is using her silk to trap some of the apes on like the rocks that are floating, and
like
that's
Spider-Man.
fun. And I remember I saw some kind of thing, like some advertisement that showed Godzilla with wings, And for a second, I'm like, did they cut like Mothra and Godzilla doing a double kind of threat thing? Why?
Yeah.
That's the coolest shit. Do that.
Well, because like there's that moment where like it's the shot of the trailer where they're like running, Kong and Godzilla are running together, and then Kong like hangs off the side of Godzilla, like off his spikes.
Yeah.
And it's actually pretty cool. It's a great, like, again, as like a kid and you're playing with your toys and you're like, Kong's gonna ride Godzilla into the battle, like that kind of thing.
And then Mothra would glide up right above them.
Yeah, that's
if you were a creative child.
If you're a creative 10-year-old.
Like Godzilla versus Kong, my favorite creative action figure play.
Yeah, but I mean, I guess like my only problem with Mothra, and I actually have this problem with King of the Monsters, is just like her design. I think is like it's too like grounded and like realistic. Where if I have any problems, I think with like the design of these characters, it's that like Kong looks like a big ape, and like is kind of like weirdly proportional, and everything's kind of he's just big. And same with Godzilla, like he. I love, like, in the 2014 one, he's, like, very chunky, very big, like, and I feel like with Mothra, like, one of the things I love about, like, the Showa era movies are, like, just how great that design is, and, like, the big eyes, like, the really big, like, blue eyes, I think are really great.
They need to find a better middle ground between the classic Mothra and Insectoid. There's a happy medium you could get.
Yeah.
I think. Like, honestly, even the Mudos, who often get decried in that, I think there's a way you could have evolved the Mudos into, like, that kind of thing, but for Mothra, I think it would just add, like, giant wings and, make it maybe a bit more butterfly-ish.
Yeah.
But it feels more grounded in a way. I agree that's to the detriment of the design.
Yeah, like, she looks like a bug, but not in a creative or interesting way, I think.
No Bug's Life here. No Flick. No Heimlich.
Jesus. Yeah, but I like that it's a surprise, like, surprise Mothra. I like the way that she's used in, like, from a plot perspective. It's very similar to, like, I like her being the mediator between, like, the two, right? Where it's like I love, like, I think Bryan Henry's like, well, last time these two met, like, it wasn't good for, like, the world. And so I like Mothra kind of being, like, this mediator that kind of, like, gets them to, like, not fight and work together. It's nice, I think. Even though she disappears for a lot of the movie and just kind of shows up as like, I'm here again.
And then, well, goodbye, everybody. We had such a fun time together.
Right.
And I do like how she's at least used, like, her plot purpose makes sense of her being the intermediary, which is going back to classic Showa stuff like Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, Godzilla with terrible language, the twins.
So funny. So
which
good.
I'm not a big fan of how they've, like, this is a consistent thing as well. I'm not a fan of how they've kind of replaced the twins in the Monsterverse. The great twin characters, because in King of the Monsters, it's the most, like, this got destroyed by editing thing. With, I believe it's Ziyi Zhang's character, Dr. Eileen Chen, where there's the whole thing where, like, they open up her, like, little fucking scrapbook, and it's like, oh, she has a twin sister? So they're the twins? The worst. Like, the worst way to shoehorn that in, truly. She plays, Dr. Eileen Chen and Dr. Ling. They are both twins, never meet in the movie, never say hi to each other, never have any indication they have any kind of relationship whatsoever. Just to the degree that it's not explained before that, to the degree that she's, like, in the Mothra scene, and she's also with, like, Bradley Whitford in them, the actress, and you're like, wait, how, what? They're, like, in subterranean Earth, and she's, like, on the surface. What's happening?
Yeah. It's
that,
weird.
and, like, in this one, having it be, like, Haley Wattel's character, who was a fun character, I think, in the last movie. Solid presence in that movie. Not huge, but just enough. And here it just kind of feels like she's left out there to dry. Like, remember you were in the last movie. Now you're a bit older. Do something like, I don't know. Like, I went through puberty. I'm a very different person than I was in the last movie.
Yeah. I mean, that is the part of the movie when they kind of get to the village and all that stuff where I'm clocking out a bit. Where I'm kind of just like
misusing Fala Chen as their queen, who's just like there.
Yeah, she is literally just there.
Yeah. But we've been talking for quite a while about Godzilla X Kong: The New Empire. Do you have any final thoughts, Brian? Anything we haven't mentioned? Anything you want to maybe wrap up with?
Well, there is one. There's one more thing. We haven't talked about, which is Kong's got an arm. He's got a robot
yes.
arm, and it's kind of cool, I guess. I don't know. it's like fun.
I think it's a big payoff of like Two-Fake thing, because like they established the reason he has the arm is that he gets his arm partially frozen by Shimu.
Yeah,
and then like he breaks it off, but like he's severely damaged, so he needs he's disabled. Mm-hmm. And needs some assistance, and good on Kong.
Yeah. So we had this idea of like augmenting him, but like the government was like, you can't do that. That's ridiculous. Why are you gonna make these guys more powerful than they are? But the prototype is still there, so we can go get it. I actually kind of really like that plot, like how they get the big arm and everything. I don't know. It's just it's there. I think he doesn't do too much with it. It's not like
it's just a cool new bit he can have, so they can sell a different toy of Kong.
Exactly right.
Basically, but in like a fun way, not like an unfun way necessarily. Especially when trivia, a big thing. So, King Kong Escapes is the last Toho movie for a while until versus Kong, Godzilla vs. Kong came out, which is a co-production with Legendary, of course. And originally in the 90s, they wanted to do a sequel to King Kong vs. Godzilla, or a remake in the 90s during the Heisei era, but that fell apart. And then they were going to do Mechani-Kong in a project called Godzilla vs. Mechani-Kong, who was in Godzilla Escapes. But even to use Kong's likeness would have cost them an extreme amount of money, because we didn't talk about this really. There's a weird rights thing with King Kong. He's been through different studios. The original's an RKO production, which I think made it lapse into weird copyright, because that studio, when it folded. Dino De Laurentiis made the two in the 70s and the 80s, and then... I
think Universal made the Peter Jackson one, right?
Yes, that's true. Yes, now Warner Bros. And Legendary obviously making these movies. It's interesting how he's changed different hands a lot of the time. Especially when, around the time of Kong Skull Island, they opened up an Islands of Adventure attraction. So that's Universal related park. Right. Yes, it has its own animatronic Kong head that you go past. I've heard it's cool. I never got to ride it because when I went there after it had opened the last time I was there, it like kept breaking down, and we were in line for like over an hour and a half, and we're like, fuck this. It keeps breaking down as we're like getting up in the line. It was so new.
Okay.
So it's just fucking up all the time. So I didn't mention this during my Kong kind of like retrospective earlier. My first exposure to King Kong was probably Kongfrontation, the 90s Universal attraction, in which you go through like on a trolley of like it looks like a fake city, and then all of a sudden there's a giant mechanical King Kong who's right there like eating the bridge, and he's like holding on to it, and you smell banana breath when you drive by.
That sounds good. I'm looking up to see if there's like one of those videos of like the POV. I've gone on a rabbit hole with those of like just watching rides
ever since I introduced you to it, I guess.
Smelling the banana sounds so funny to me. By the way, like that's such a funny little addition to the ride.
Trivia that got closed down in favor of the Mummy in Orlando, but it was around for a while in LA until the big fire happened at Universal Studios.
Oh, right.
That was one of the casualties of it, along with so many different masters of legendary musical artists who recorded at Universal. It could never be rebuilt, so they made it into a screen thing, but the design for it, like all the footage and stuff, was designed and directed by Peter Jackson. And it's his Kong.
Very cool. Okay. My Universal experience has been very limited. I've been like once or twice.
We gotta do that at some point, Brian.
We do. I've never been...
That's on the bucket list.
Never been to the Simpsons area. When I went, they were still building it. And I'm
booking Universal tickets now. When are you free in the next week?
Well, so when I went the first time, I was a bit younger. I really wanted to go to the Harry Potter world. And it had like recently opened.
Different time.
Very different time. And they were building the Simpsons area. Like I could see like Moe's, like I could see the sign. And I was like, fuck, I want to go there. But I had to,
make it happen,
go on a Harry Potter ride and stuff. But yeah, I would love to go at some point.
This has to happen sooner rather than later. But
absolutely.
But anyway, we've gotten far off track. of Godzilla X Kong: The New Empire. That's what you get with, on the Patreon feed. They're a bit shorter than this, but it's kind of the same rambling energy.
Yeah.
I would argue. Even somehow more so than our very tight and straightforward main feed episodes.
Real tight.
Consistently.
Very concise.
Yes. But yeah, last thoughts on Godzilla X Kong: The New Empire.
The last thing I kind of want to say is I do really like Dan Stevens in this movie. I like the energy he's bringing. I like that he kind of knows the kind of movie he's in, and he's kind of at least trying to bring some of that energy, even though I think the movie's just not giving him enough to do.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't know. I just feel kind of ambivalent about this thing. Like, going into it, I was just, at least kind of curious because I didn't hate versus Kong or anything, but I thought it was just kind of mediocre. And it's kind of how I feel about this. Like, I if I was doing a ranking, I guess I would put versus Kong above this, but they're both that same kind of tier of like, mid, as the kids say these days.
So Godzilla 2014's tops, obviously. Where's Kong Skull Island in that?
It might be above both of these two, and King of the Monsters just by default, because especially as you have described it earlier when we were talking about that movie, I was like, oh man, maybe I should revisit that movie.
Shout out Mel, our guest from last week. Shout out,
yes,
who was very lovingly describing that film. I'm sorry, Mel, we didn't like it very much.
Yeah, no, not really. But yeah, probably Godzilla 2014. Then Skull Island versus Kong, New Empire, King of the Monsters at the bottom, because there's stuff I love in King of the Monsters, like a lot, but you have to trudge through so much boring and generic bullshit to get to it, where at least these two are kind of a bit more light and kind of fun. They're under 2 hours, which King of the Monsters is like 2 hours and 12 minutes or something. It's ridiculous. I don't think this is the worst, unwatchable garbage ever or anything like that. But it is very meh. It didn't really grip me. When it did, I was mildly entertained for the most part. But I really do think this is a movie like, you could go see it, get a drink or two, get some popcorn, get some candy, and you'll probably have a good time. Especially because, at least, there's a bunch of stuff coming out after this movie, but for the past month, there just has not been that much stuff in theaters. So yeah, it's a decent time at the movies.
This feels like at least the next big blockbuster post Dune Part 2.
Right.
Which that's been massively successful, but we kind of referenced this earlier. We're recording this shortly after the opening weekend. It's been longer by the time this is released, but it made $195 million worldwide on a $135 million budget. That's a good start.
Yeah.
We'll see if, the second weekend dive is massive. Hey everybody, this is Future Thomas. Recording this on May 5th, 2024, so over a month since we recorded this episode. And just wanted to point out, as we were just questioning the future box office performance of Godzilla X Kong: The New Empire, one, it is still in theaters as of this recording, and it has made $188 million domestically in the U.S. and a worldwide total of $546.8 million. So despite our thoughts on the movie, it's doing very well, and we're definitely going to get more Monsterverse movies, so good on them. Adam Wingard and all people Legendary and Warner Brothers for that. And now, back to the regular episode, as previously recorded. But these movies have been doing pretty well. Especially, not King of the Monsters as much, right? That was the one that kind of bombed.
Right. And like it makes sense actually, because like they are very fun movies and they're very light, and you can go into it and you can kind of turn your brain off and watch some silly like dumb action, and like the characters are silly, and it all doesn't feel too weighty and dramatic. Like you need you can also just kind of zone out for a bit of this movie and you'll catch up pretty quickly, I think. But again, I guess I just want to hammer home my earlier thought about Adam Wingard, which is that like I want him to make something else. And it's not that I'm like upset with that he's making like big movies or movies that are like based on like IP or whatever, but I just want to see what he can do, because he's clearly a good director, and even within these like Monsterverse movies, I think he has like still got a lot of like the things that make his movies, but I just want to see him kind of cash out and maybe make something smaller, maybe make something that he wants to make, maybe kind of, cash in that check that he's, been getting. Because I don't know, I'm just kind of really bored by these movies in a weird way, which I shouldn't be, because I'm loving the Showa era stuff, and I love the idea of these going more silly and goofy. But like I said earlier, I don't think they're silly enough. I think you really need to dive in, like, really dig into that sillier, goofier side of things and go really big and bananas. Because I don't think this is silly enough. But yeah, those are my thoughts, I guess.
Yeah, my final thoughts aren't too dissimilar. I agree with you about the ranking, but I will say, I think there's a definitive, like, Godzilla 2014 is the best of these. I have problems with it, but I think it's, like, the best sort of American execution of a Godzilla movie currently. Then Kong Skull Island, I think, is fun and junky. Same thing with, I would say, versus Kong. I think that's where those fit firmly. Just, like, these are, like, fun, like, not especially memorable, but enough, like, charm to them that, like, they're watchable kind of thing. Mm-hmm. Then X-Kong would be, in terms of the ranking, it's very much like a mixed bag. All the worst impulses from versus Kong are very much highlighted, and some of the bonuses aren't here as much anymore. And then King of the Monsters is, like, crushing disappointment.
Oh yeah,
truly, I think the most disappointing Godzilla movie to me, especially being someone who was, like, actually caught up, because I was watching the Showa movies, and I'm like, fucking Mothra, fucking Rodan, these new faves of mine. Can't wait for Michael Dougherty to make these guys, like, really pop, and fucking crushed so much. Which is why Godzilla X Kong New Empire is at least a bit above, but yeah, has a lot of issues, some fun little elements, like, the whip thing that Scar King has. We didn't talk about that.
Very cool.
The fucking, like, vertebrae, like, spine thing. Very fun.
David Cronenberg would like that.
Yes,
bone whip,
sure.
Bone gun.
The various, bits of character animation, but it just feels a bit inconsistent. And this one definitely feels like the most mixed bag to me of these Monsterverse movies, So, not terrible to me, but also, I agree with you. Not one that, like, would stick in my, high in my kaiju rank, for sure. Well, on that note, let's go ahead and get into our weekly segment, Between the Lines. So, Between the Lines is a segment that Bryan and I do every episode of the show, in which we talk about, a movie that we want to recommend that is somehow related to the movie we're talking about today, or maybe related to the criteria of this particular episode near the end for news. So, Bryan, you're starting us off. What is your recommendation for this edition of Between the Lines?
Yeah, I'm going to go with this week another Adam Wingard movie that we talked about a bit earlier. I'm recommending The Guest. It's weird to think, actually, that this is Adam Wingard's last original film, essentially. He hasn't done anything else. It's all been kind of based off previous IP since then, but I think this movie is absolutely fantastic. And I remember when I saw it, I did not really enjoy it that much. I think for a lot of reasons that I think were external. Like, I think I had watched it, like, the week after, like, a mass shooting, and this is a movie that really is not good to watch after that, because it is, dealing with a lot of that stuff in a very interesting way. But in case anyone doesn't know, I guess, though, this movie is about a soldier, played by Dan Stevens, who we talked about earlier, who shows up at this family's house, and their son has recently been deceased. He was killed in action in the Middle East, in the military, and he says, I served with your son, I knew him, and he kind of gets close to them, and maybe some revelations are revealed about who he is and what his past is and stuff like that. And for one thing, I think just this is an incredible Dan Stevens performance. I think that this movie is it's a movie that looks at Dan Stevens and goes like, this guy is perfect. Like, he's this perfect specimen. You know, he has the deepest blue eyes in the world. He looks so handsome. He's just so perfect, and really kind of twists that and kind of uses that to a lot of really kind of unsettling and kind of dark elements, which I love. And I think Stevens is really kind of just, he carries this entire thing, and I think it's a real showcase performance. I think I was telling you about this a few days ago, but like, really a showcase for like why this guy should be like an A-list movie star. And he's like been in stuff like, I think he was in like Legion, which a lot of people love, which I've never seen actually.
I saw the pilot for Legion. Interesting pilot.
Okay. But yeah, I think just he is really incredible in this movie. And I think like it has that kind of Adam Wingard like dark comedy, but also that like neon soaked like aesthetic. And this movie has just incredible vibes, just great vibes. I think it looks incredible. Like, it's really well directed. And I think, you know, because it's him working on like a somewhat bigger budget than he got to work on with like You're Next. It's not over budget. It's still an indie film and works so well for this movie. And I think it has such a really keen sense of tone. I think one of the best final, I won't spoil it, of course, but like final lines and final like shots of a movie. It's just absolutely incredible. And I think the entire cast is great. Like, you've got like Micah Monroe is in here, you got Sheila Kelly, Leland Orser is in it, you have Lance Reddick as
The late great Lance Reddick in a wonderful role.
Yes.
Instead of him being cut to shit out of Godzilla vs. Kong,
Oh, was he?
he's like in a couple shots. He's just with Kyle Chandler in all those scenes that were clearly shot at the same time as all the other actors, and not because Kyle Chandler had scheduling conflicts.
Oh, that is such a shame. He's really incredible in The Guest, and like, yeah, just
Ethan Embry also shows up. Joel David Moore of the Avatar movies.
yes.
I've told you my origin story with The Guest, right?
I don't think so. I don't. Remember.
I saw it at South by Southwest at
right.
a midnight screening at a neon-soaked theater where Adam Wingard and Simon Barrett did an intro.
Hell yeah. And I'm sure it like killed there. Like, I'm sure that movie.
Amazingly, to the degree that like I didn't revisit it for so long until shout out Target Audience Podcast, which I did a guest appearance on during our last season. We ended up talking about that movie, me and Ben Miller, and what's so interesting about that movie really is like it's a bit more commercial than like Your Next, but also it feels so hard to sell as a movie.
Yeah, it does. It absolutely does. And it is more commercial in that like obviously the budget's bigger. They have like actual sets, actual like, you know, production design and stuff like that. It's not just one setting like You're Next.
And it's that intense gore, but there is intense violence at the same time.
No, absolutely. I think the violence in it is, and this is the point of the movie, obviously, but like, is very disturbing and very unsettling, I think. And it really kind of, it does a really great thing of pulling the rug from under you when you think you have a grasp on what this movie is, and then it's a completely different movie. And I love both parts of this movie, but I think it's such a wild like shift of what the movie becomes from where it starts.
And also, just to really emphasize, like with my screening, like imagine me who does not know Dan Stevens at all. I had not seen Downton Abbey, which he kind of broke out in, where he was in for 2 seasons and he's like, kill me, apparently, and he just never was on the show again after that. And the introduction in The Guest, where like just the doorbell rings, I believe it's the mom answers, you see Dan Stevens is back, and then he like twists on one foot around, and it's like, oh, hello, ma'am, and you're just like, I have to invite David Collins into my home.
Yeah, God, he is like so magnetic in this movie, and obviously some of it is like he's putting on that like that kind of southern like hospitality, like, well, yes, ma'am, I'm yes, thank you very much,
with
ma'am.
the drawl, a very good American accent from Mr. British Dan Stevens.
Incredible. And like it's part of like he's doing that, and then I won't spoil too much, but like his character goes.
We might talk about
through
the
a
guest at some
change.
point on this show. I'm willing
I'd
to
love
do
to.
that. And
Absolutely.
a little bit down the line. Let Ben have priority on it for now. But a great movie, my favorite Adam Wingard movie. Also a great Simon Barrett. Like he gets underrated, I think, in terms of kind of like the rise of Wingard, because he wrote like You're Next and a lot of the earlier collaborations. He's a very talented writer. I heard his directorial debut was really good recently, the Shudder one. It's about like a cult of like teens or something. Heard it was pretty good.
Oh, Seance. Yeah, I heard about this.
Seance.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I really quick. I just very quickly want to shout out
One more thing.
just one more thing, Thomas. I love Dan Stevens so much, and again, I would love for him to be in big movies, working with interesting like directors and stuff like that, because I think he's just so great. And I was looking at his filmography, which we'll get to one movie of his that he did in a minute, but I just like I love him in like Eurovision. I think he's so great in that. I think he's also great in something like Her Smell, the Alex Ross Perry movie.
I haven't seen that movie. I've heard very good things about that.
He's fantastic in that movie, and yeah, and like his biggest role is in like Beauty and the Beast, where he's the Beast, which I'm happy that for his bank account, I guess, and it also
Plus
feels
those
like
pictures of him inside of that suit.
Yeah,
That like
really
on
funny.
set.
It also kind of feels like a movie where it's like, this guy's perfect. We have to kind of like, there's something wrong with that. We have to kind of like mess with it in some way. But yeah, I just love him. I hope to see him in more stuff. And yeah, I don't know. I've just really re-fallen in love with him after rewatching The Guest. And I think everyone should watch The Guest.
You like seeing him, but what if you heard him briefly
Even
in a
better.
small supporting role? As is the case with my recommendation. I went for more and for new, and thought more in like the kaiju vein. So I'm recommending a 2022 film called The Sea Beast, which was released on Netflix, directed by Chris Williams, who's a pretty solid animation director. His credits include Bolt and Moana, in terms of like his writing and kind of like co-directing stuff. And he's got this movie here, The Sea Beast, which takes place in sort of like a time of pirates, because there's this whole thing with this main character voiced by Carl Urban, who is a hunter of sea monsters, but it's like sort of colonial era. He's like in the Master and Commander kind of ship, which now that's a movie. They ever do Master and Commander 2
I've
with sea
never
monsters?
seen it. Weirdly, it's one of my bigger blinds. I know. Everyone,
But the oceans are battlefields. I don't know if you knew this.
I've seen like that, like that title card so many times.
Yes, 100%. You can wear it as a shirt now. But anyway, so Carl Urban, he's like a famous, sea beast hunter, where they hunt these massive sea beasts that are like kaiju size, like they're literal giant monsters. But at one point, he harbors in town, and an orphan named Maisie, voiced by Zaris Angel Hator, sneaks on his ship. As chaos has happened, there's this one big sort of like red kaiju sea beast that you see a lot. It's kind of like the main character who follows us around, but there's a lot of different creative kaiju designs. There's a lot of great like fights, and the scale that we were talking about was missing from X Kong is very much here, with like these giant sea beasts go over like the ship or like ground up against it. There's real weight there, and there's a lot of like really well designed like camera angles for the different action sequences of them trying to hunt him down. Carl Urban's a really fun voice. Other people have voices like Jared Harris, great actor, of course.
Yes.
Jim Carter, the smart guy from Wonka, that guy.
Oh right.
The accountant guy from Wonka, yeah.
Hell yeah.
Dan Stevens also has like a small supporting role. So it's a really solid Netflix animation movie. It's a shame, this came out around the time that Netflix slashed a lot of their animation budget for a lot of different things, and it's a shame that kind of like clouded this one. Even though it got nominated for Best Animated Feature Oscar, losing to Del Toro's Pinocchio, only fair. Of the two Netflix movies, that's the one you give it to. But still, The Sea Beast, quite fun, and definitely my recommendation for this week. Have you seen this one?
I haven't actually. I do remember when it came out though, and I remember kind of being curious, and I always kind of try to view all of the Best Animated Picture nominees, but I missed this one, and I think a part of it is the length. Does it feel long? 'Cause it's 2 hours here, I'm saying, but does it feel long at all?
Well, to be fair, look, it's a Netflix 2 hours.
So like the credits are like 20 minutes or something.
Well, also, in animation films in general, it's at least
Yeah.
going to be like 7 minutes or so long.
Yeah.
And then Netflix adds like, hey, here's who voiced this in Hindi. and
Right,
this
they
in
add all
this
that
language.
stuff.
Yeah, so that kind of credits, yeah. But yeah, this one's fun. I'd recommend it to anybody. So just to recap our titles here before we head into the end of the show, Brian.
Yes, I had Adam Wingard's 2014 movie, The Guest.
And I had the Netflix animated film from 2022, The Sea Beast, featuring a lot of sea kaiju. But on that note, let's wrap up here. We want to thank some people like Burial Grid for our music for the show. Purchase his music at burialgrid.com. Thanks to Michelle Kyle for our artwork. Find her at MishKyle96 on Twitter. And thanks to our Patreon supporters, our Cineast Patreon supporters, where for just $1 a month, you all get access to bonus episodes, as well as get to pick at least one episode per main feed season that we talk about in a poll. We just want to, mention around this time, if you want to hear us go even more ape after Kong, we would have already released our Planet of the Apes full franchise. We haven't recorded that yet, but should be a lot of fun, Brian, as we kind of go through the 9 movies before, in a couple days from when this comes out, Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes comes out. And we'll definitely have a review of that movie, I'm sure, on the Patreon as well, shortly after it comes out. And also we'll have in May our Mad Max Fury Road audio commentary. Very exciting.
Hell yes.
Very excited for Furiosa, and can't wait to watch that great movie again.
Oh man, that new Fury, like newer, by the time this is coming out, that newer Furiosa trailer is just like fucking cocaine, man. It's so good.
I'll wait until we see it.
Ooh,
Definitely a movie I have carved out I want to see it multiple times that opening weekend. I'm very
for
curious.
sure.
Hopefully it doesn't disappoint me. We'll find out.
Never doubt George Miller.
I don't know. Happy Feet's not great. I said it.
3,000 Years of Longing, though.
That's a great movie.
Great movie. What a movie.
So is Happy Feet 2.
I've actually never seen
I agree
Happy
with that
Feet
take.
2.
Happy Feet 2, good movie. Very weird movie. Much more fun. But on that note, we should just mention we'll also have some other audio reviews out there, from modern releases. The summer's coming up. I'm sure there's some other big movies. Oh, oh God. I just forgot any of the movies coming out besides Mad Max and Apes.
We got The Fall Guy. We got fucking...
Are we going to do that? I don't know. Are you sure?
I'm just naming movies that are coming out.
I don't know. That was the first one you mentioned. I think you're very excited for.
It's
David Leitch, your favorite filmmaker.
God, I don't like David
I
Leitch.
heard there was good reviews out of the initial.
There were.
We'll see.
Yeah, there's stuff coming out. We got
I don't know. We're literally going to have a meeting after this.
got that John Krasinski movie.
Oh, if. Oh, boy.
God.
Exactly what we want to see. The trailer that you don't, retch at every time it shows up in a theater.
I did literally, ugh. And then, I pulled my phone out just to not have to watch that trailer.
Godzilla X. R.I.P. Louis Gossett Jr. as
Yes.
well. Yes, one of his last movies will be that one. Great. Anyway, so that's all on the Patreon. If you become a Cineast, you get to hear all that great stuff over at patreon.com/cinema2letter. Which also, that's our handle on the socials, your Instagrams, your Blue Skies, your Twitters, all those great places you love hanging out, at cinema2letter. And also, I'm at Twitter and Letterboxd at Not The Who's Tommy. I also do some writing at film-cred.com.
Yeah, and you can also follow me on Twitter, where I'm on there sometimes. I guess my twice a day where I go on Twitter in the morning when I wake up, because I love to wake up to hell, and at night before I go to bed, because I also like to just
Rocks you back to sleep.
yeah, and I like to have nightmares. But you can follow me on there at BRYANDRADE and the number 3, or you can follow me on Letterboxd, where I'm much more active, and I've officially started my Godzilla ranking list, Thomas. So it's very exciting stuff is happening over here.
I can't wait to judge you on it.
Oh man, it'd be really, really interesting to see. But yeah, follow me on there.
And subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and other podcasting platforms. If you're listening on Talk Film Society, why not listen to all the other great shows that are on here on the network? And you can also dig into the archives on our Podbean main feed for, all the previous episodes of Cinema to the Letter and the Double Edge Double Bill stuff is all there. And, if you can't support us on the Patreon for the $1, it's cool. Money can be tight. But the free way to help us out is just rate, review, or simply share the show around to give us visibility, especially I just gotta say, I looked at the analytics. We need a lot more Hollow Earth listeners. When Kong goes to the dentist, can we be like, hey, listen to the letter. Spread the word around to those other apes.
Hey, man, I mean, even the Scar King, I'll take him as a listener.
Sure, just don't send us an email, Scar King. We don't want to hear your thoughts on modern cinema and maybe representation. But on that note, I think it's time we talk about just, we'll tease. It's time that we teased our next episode, Brian, which is our E for Egregious, which is Godzilla vs. Mothra from 1992. So this is our Heisei era entry for this particular Godzilla season. You have not started watching any of that era. That's the era from 85 to 95. You haven't watched any of that, right?
No, not yet. I'm planning on barreling through the Showa era this week, and then getting into the Heisei era. I'm very curious because I don't really have any kind of concept of what those movies are like, really. So yeah, I'm very curious.
It'll be interesting to discuss for sure. And guys, if you're gonna ask, I'm gonna repeat this like I did in the mini episode and probably here. It's not my least favorite Godzilla movie. I have some mixed thoughts on it. We'll get into it. Maybe, I don't know, after Godzilla X Kong might improve a bit. We don't know. We'll find out next time. But until then, everybody, you know what? It's time that we multiplied here, Brian. Thomas X Bryan, the new podcast empire. Exactly.
What is the new empire referring to in this movie, actually? Like, what is it? I don't know.
I think it's the new paradigm shift of Godzilla and Kong are bros now.
Okay.
That's the new empire.
Well, I'm very happy for them.
Well, I'm glad we got to this at the very end of the episode. Good night, everybody.